Greetings, fellow fans. You're tuned into Veil Soul, presenting to you today, what if Temari discovered Naruto's darkest secret and used it to betray the Sand Village? Show some love by liking and subscribing. Enjoy the story ahead. Chapter 1. The Shape of a Secret. The mission scroll said diplomatic liaison, which was just a polite way of saying Suna needed Konoha to stop dragging its feet on the border patrol agreement, and nobody trusted a lower-ranked shinobi to deliver that particular message with the right combination of pressure and charm. Temari could do both. She'd been doing both since she was 12. She arrived at the Konoha gates on a Tuesday afternoon in early autumn, when the leaves were just starting to turn, and the village smelled like wood smoke and something frying in oil from a stall near the market district. 2 tuning guards checked her credentials with the practiced efficiency of people who had done it 10,000 times, stamped her visitor's pass, and pointed her toward the administrative district with a friendliness that she had always found slightly unnerving. Konoha people smiled too easily. In Suna, a smile usually meant something was being calculated behind it. Here they just seemed to mean it, which somehow felt like its own kind of deception. She didn't bring Kankuro. She almost never did for this kind of work. Her brother was exceptional in a fight and catastrophic in a meeting room, and the last time they'd both attended a joint mission briefing, he'd spent 40 minutes arguing with a Konoha Jonin about the tensile strength of chakra wire in desert climates, and they'd nearly lost the whole partnership over it. Temari had smoothed it over, but she'd decided right then that some tools were better left in the shed. The Hokage office was on the upper floor of the administration building, and Tsunade had left instructions at the front desk that Temari was to be shown directly up. The Chunin receptionist, a young woman with ink-stained fingers and a slightly overwhelmed expression, led her through corridors lined with old mission reports and photographs of previous Hokage, past a break room where someone had left a pot of tea going cold on the counter, up 2 flights of stairs, and then knocked twice on a heavy oak door before opening it. Tsunade was at her desk, which was remarkable because half the time Temari arrived for these meetings to find the Hokage had stepped out for approximately 45 minutes to do something that was never clearly explained. Today she was actually present, reading through a stack of documents with a cup of sake at her elbow that she made no effort to hide. A tall Jonin with silver hair and a mask over the lower half of his face stood to one side of the desk. Hade Kakashi. Temari recognized him immediately, because it was hard not to recognize the man who'd carried a reputation the size of a small country since before most of the current generation of shinobi had started at the academy. Temari! Tsunade set down her documents and gestured at the chair across the desk. Sit! We'll get through the border agreement in about an hour if neither of us decides to be unreasonable. I'm never unreasonable, Temari said, sitting down and crossing her ankles, her fan propped against the chair beside her. I'm precise. That sounds like something an unreasonable person would say. Tsunade pulled a separate document from a drawer. Let's start with the patrol rotation. They were 40 minutes into it, and making reasonable progress, because Temari had come prepared with 3 alternative schedules that gave Suna what it needed without making Konoha feel like they were conceding anything, when a knock came at the door and a young woman in an ANBU vest leaned in and said something quietly to Kakashi. His visible eye shifted to Tsunade. "The Shimura matter," he said. Tsunade's expression didn't change, but something in her shoulders did, a subtle tightening that Temari noticed because she noticed everything. "We'll deal with it after. He's asking for the files today. He can keep asking." Tsunade looked at Temari with an expression that managed to be both apologetic and completely unyielding. 10 minutes. Kakashi will take you to the waiting area on the 3rd floor. There's tea, and it's better than whatever you were served at the gates." Temari didn't argue. She picked up her fan, followed Kakashi out of the office and down the corridor, and was shown into a small room with cushioned chairs and a window that looked out over the rooftops toward the Hokage monument. The tea, as promised, was excellent, some kind of jasmine blend that probably cost more than a week of standard mission pay. Kakashi closed the door from the outside, and she heard his footsteps head back down the corridor toward the office. She sat for about 3 minutes. The tea was good. The view was fine. And then she heard voices from the room directly adjacent to this one. separated by a wall that was clearly thinner than whoever had designed this building had intended, and she heard a name that made her set down her cup very carefully and go absolutely still. Uzumaki's development is ahead of schedule, a voice she didn't recognize. Male measured, the kind of flat affect that belonged to someone who had been giving orders in sterile rooms for a very long time. The latest assessment from our embedded observer puts his chakra reserves at roughly 4 times what the previous report indicated. Controlled access to the Nine Tails chakra is progressing. A second voice, younger, more uncertain, clearly someone receiving rather than giving orders. Danzo-sama, Tsunade has restricted access to any further. Tsunade restricts what she can see. She can't restrict what she doesn't know exists. A pause, the soft sound of paper being moved. The question isn't whether Uzumaki can be used. He already is being used every time they send him on a high-risk extraction mission and call it field training. The question is who controls the conditions of that use. The third's approach was sentimental. We don't have the luxury. Temari didn't move. She sat with her hands in her lap and her fan across her knees, and she listened to the wall with the focused attention of someone who has spent their entire life understanding that information was the only currency that never devalued. The containment protocols in the seal are designed for the last resort, not for optimization. There's a difference between keeping a weapon from exploding in your hand and sharpening it. The flat voice had the patience of someone explaining arithmetic to a slow student. The boy is 17. In 3 years, he'll either be positioned correctly or he'll be a variable we can't afford. Root's assessment is clear. Controlled integration of the Cubai's power, guided by the right conditions and the right psychological architecture, produces an asset. Uncontrolled, he produces a catastrophe. We are simply ensuring the former. And the psychological architecture is already largely in place. The isolation protocols from his childhood did most of the work. He thinks of himself as someone who has to earn belonging. That's useful. People who need to earn things will keep performing. The goal is to reinforce that framework without letting him realize it's a framework. Another pause. The letters from the Hawkage office that were redirected last spring, has he asked about them? No, sir. Good. Keep it that way. There was the sound of chairs moving, documents being stacked, and then footsteps heading toward a different door, one that opened into the corridor on the far side of that room, not the one connecting to hers. The voices faded. Silence came back into the small waiting room like water filling a space. Temari sat with it for a long moment. She picked up her tea, took a careful sip, set it back down. Then she looked out the window at the village that had spent the better part of a decade being held up as a model of what a shinobi society should look like. And she thought about several things at once with the kind of cold, partitioned clarity that Gaara always said made her the most frightening person in their family. She thought about Uzumaki Naruto specifically. She had a working file on him in her head the way she had working files on everyone she'd encountered more than twice in a professional context. It was just how her mind organized information. What she knew, Jonin ranked officially, though half the village still seemed to treat him like he was perpetually in the Chunin exams. Jinchuriki of the Nine-Tailed Fox. Responsible in some significant way for Gaara's transformation from a weapon into a person, which was a thing she still hadn't entirely sorted out how to feel about. Gratitude was complicated when the thing you were grateful for also represented your own failure to reach your brother first. Loud, impractical, had a way of staring at problems until they gave up out of sheer stubbornness. She'd seen him fight once, during the chaos of the Akatsuki's early movements, from a distance, and had filed that away too. The way he moved was nothing like how he talked. All that frantic noise and scrambling bravado dropping away into something that was just very fast and very certain. What she knew now, someone in Konoha's power structure had been actively shaping his psychology since before he was old enough to understand what psychology was, with the explicit goal of turning him into a controllable weapon. Redirected letters. Isolation protocols. 3 years before he became a variable they couldn't afford. She thought about the voice, Danzo. She knew the name. Everyone in the intelligence community knew the name. The way you knew the name of a chronic weather pattern that kept destroying crops in the same valley. Root, the other organization, the one Konoha officially didn't acknowledge in formal documents and practically never mentioned in joint briefings. She'd flagged it twice in reports for the Sooner Intelligence Division, and both times the Elder Council had noted it and moved on without comment, because what Root did inside Konoha was, technically, Konoha's problem. Except now she was sitting in Konoha's waiting room with a cup of cooling jasmine tea and the very clear understanding that it was about to become everyone's problem if the timeline in that conversation was anything to go by. 3 years. The door opened. Kakashi leaned in with an expression she couldn't read because half his face was covered and the other half had apparently been trained since birth to express nothing. "She's ready for you." "Of course," Temari said, and stood and picked up her fan and walked back into Tsunede's office with the same precise neutrality she'd walked out with, and spent the next 50 minutes finalizing the Border Patrol agreement without letting a single syllable of what she'd heard leak into her posture, her tone, or her eyes. She was, after all, a professional. The inn Konoha assigned to visiting dignitaries from allied villages was comfortable in a way that felt slightly aggressive about it. Heavy curtains, soft mattresses, a small sitting area with fresh flowers that were replaced every morning, breakfast that arrived exactly when you asked for it. Temari sat at the writing desk in her room that evening with a blank piece of paper in front of her and a pen she hadn't yet uncapped. She was thinking about what to do with what she knew. The straightforward option was to report it. Write it up tonight, send it via secure channel to Suna's Intelligence Division, let the Elder Council decide what to do. That was the proper procedure. That was, technically, exactly what she was supposed to do with information of strategic relevance gathered during a diplomatic visit. She thought about Elder Chiyo, gone now, but alive in her memory as a specific kind of cautionary tale. Chiyo had gathered information and weaponized it in service of Suna's survival for 40 years, and the result had been Gaara. Not Gaara as he was now, but Gaara at 12, 13, 14, the thing that barely slept, the thing that killed anyone who came too close, the thing that Temari had watched from across the room with a careful distance because the alternative was being killed by her own brother, and she hadn't been strong enough to stop him. The Elder Council had thought they were protecting Suna. They'd thought a weapon without vulnerability was a successful weapon. The math had made sense. The results had been a disaster. She uncapped the pen, wrote 2 words at the top of the page, stared at them. Uzumaki Naruto. She thought about what Danzo had said. The isolation protocols from his childhood did most of the work. She'd heard variations of that logic her entire life, applied to Gaara, applied to herself and Kankuro in softer forms. You shaped a shinobi by shaping their needs. You gave them the right hungers, and then you fed those hungers strategically. You made belonging conditional. You made worth transactional. She'd spent years believing it was just the nature of the shinobi world. Suna did it. Konoha did it. Everyone did it. It wasn't cruelty, it was architecture, infrastructure for reliability. But she'd also watched Gaara, who had been the most thoroughly architected weapon Suna had ever produced, fall apart at 17 when a loud, ridiculous, infuriating boy from another village sat across from him in a pile of rubble and told him he was worth something without charging anything for the information. And she'd watched Gaara rebuild into something that was actually functional, actually stable, actually capable of leading a village, not because the architecture held, but because someone had gone outside it. She crossed out the 2 words, wrote something else. What does he know? That was the real question, wasn't it? Danzo had said he thinks of himself as someone who has to earn belonging with the confidence of someone who had been watching from a distance for a long time. But Naruto was not, in Temari's professional assessment, a simple read. The loud, open, I will be Hawkage performance was real. She didn't think he was consciously strategic about it. But underneath, it was something that had survived being the village pariah for the first decade of its life, and come out the other side still wanting to protect that same village, which was either the most profound form of emotional damage she'd ever encountered or something else entirely. She wasn't sure which. She needed to know which before she decided what to do with what she'd heard. She folded the paper, slipped it into her vest pocket, and went to bed. She didn't sleep much. When she did, she dreamed about wind moving through a building she couldn't see the outside of, and when she woke up the dream stayed with her like a splinter. She found him the next morning, which was almost too easy. Naruto was not a difficult person to locate in Konoha, because he moved through the village like a small localized weather event that other people arranged themselves around. She tracked him from the inn to the market district to a ramen stall where he was eating with the focused intensity of a man who had earned something. His Jonin vest open over an orange undershirt that should have been retired years ago and probably wouldn't be retired until it disintegrated. She sat down 2 stools away, ordered tea because she wasn't hungry, and waited. He noticed her after about 40 seconds. She could tell from the way his shoulders shifted, the slight pause in the rhythm of his eating, even though he didn't look up immediately. "Temari," he said, around a mouthful of noodles. "Naruto." She wrapped both hands around her cup. He finally looked up. He had the kind of face that was difficult to be blank. Everything moved on it, too much surface area for expression, whisker marks and all. He was assessing her the same way she was assessing him, and she noted not for the first time that he was better at that than he let on. "You're in town for the border thing. Finished it yesterday." "Huh," he went back to his ramen, then stopped again. "You're still here, though. My return transit doesn't leave until tomorrow morning." "Right." He ate another bite. The old man behind the counter refilled his bowl without being asked, and Naruto thanked him with the kind of warmth that was clearly habitual, not performed, just there, the default setting. She watched him do it and thought about isolation protocols and psychological architecture and felt something unpleasant shift in her chest. "You want to spar," he said. She looked at him. "What?" "You're sitting there drinking tea at 7 in the morning 2 stools away from me with that look you get when you're thinking about something you don't want to think about." He gestured with his chopsticks. "Usually when I'm like that it helps to hit something. That's because you're you. And you're you, and you've got a giant fan on your back, so I figure you probably feel the same way." He said it matter-of-factly, like he was discussing weather patterns. "Training Ground 7 is open in the mornings. The team that usually uses it is on a mission." She should have said number. She had letters to draft, observations to organize, a report to decide whether or not to file. She had a full day of careful, quiet work ahead of her that did not benefit in any way from spending an hour getting hit by chakra-enhanced wind techniques in a field on the east side of Konoha. "Fine," she said. "But don't complain when I'm not gentle about it." The expression that crossed his face was not quite a smile and not quite a challenge. It landed somewhere in between, and she told herself very firmly that she didn't find it interesting in any way. Training Ground 7 had 3 training posts, a cleared central area roughly 30 meters across, and a ring of trees that were scarred at chest height by what looked like decades of indiscriminate jutsu practice. The morning air was cool, still carrying that autumn sharpness, and the light came through the trees at a low angle that turned everything slightly gold. Naruto stood in the center of the cleared area with his hands in his pockets, watching her adjust her grip on her fan. "Rules," he said. "Don't kill each other. That's a low bar. Those are my terms." She snapped the fan open to its full width, the 3 purple circles stark against the pale fabric, and the air moved ahead of it even without any chakra behind the gesture, just the physical displacement of a weapon that big opening at speed. He dropped his hands from his pockets. Just like that, the thing she'd noticed before, the shift in register, happened again. The easiness didn't go away, exactly, but it settled into something underneath a different layer. He was paying attention in a way that used different machinery. She opened with a sickle weasel, a sweeping horizontal cut at low level that sheared the grass ahead of it and sent a blade of compressed wind across the ground fast enough that a normal Jonin would have taken it in the shins before they registered it was coming. He was already 3 meters to the left, moving on some instinct she hadn't telegraphed into, and the wind blade hit one of the training posts and carved a clean line through the wood. She was already moving, adjusting the angle, closing the space. The fan was not just a ranged weapon, and people consistently forgot that, consistently tried to create distance as if distance solved the problem, when in fact the moment someone started running from her was the moment she controlled the shape of the fight. He didn't run. He came toward her, which was irritating, a Rasengan forming in his right hand with the casual readiness of someone reaching for a tool they use every day. And she brought the fan around in a vertical arc, and the wind wall that erupted from it was dense enough to physically slow him. She could feel the resistance in the air itself. He hit the wind wall and pushed through it. Not around it, through it, digging in and grinding forward against 60 kilograms of compressed chakra wind like he was walking into a gale and finding it mildly inconvenient. His hair whipped sideways, his eyes were narrowed against the pressure, and the Rasengan was still spinning in his hand. She had approximately half a second to appreciate that before she pivoted backward, redirected the fan, and sent the wind column sideways rather than forward so it spun off his trajectory instead of fighting it. The Rasengan hit the ground where she'd been standing and cratered it. They both landed at the edge of the cleared area, breathing harder than they'd been before, 6 meters apart. The ruined section of ground between them was smoking faintly. "You redirected that," he said, sounding genuinely interested. "Most people try to hold the wall when I push through it. Most people don't know how to lose ground strategically," she said, snapping the fan shut and open again to check the edge tension. "You're faster than your file says. My file is probably out of date." He was looking at her in that direct way of his that she'd noticed he reserved for things he was taking seriously. "You're better than your file says, too. My file is classified above your clearance level." He laughed at that, short and genuine. "Fair." He settled back into a ready stance, but not aggressive. Again, they went for another 40 minutes. She won 2 exchanges and he won 3, which she counted honestly because she was not the kind of person who miscounted. What she was learning from those 40 minutes was something she'd suspected but couldn't have quantified before. He was not fighting near his ceiling. She was somewhere in the top third of her range, pushing properly, and he was comfortable. Engaged, enjoying it, not coasting exactly, but with reserves visible in the ease of his movement that she was not seeing in herself. She called it when she felt the first edge of true fatigue, because fighting tired against someone with reserves was a lesson you only needed to learn once. "Done," she said, snapping the fan closed and settling it across her shoulder. He straightened, rolled out his neck, looked completely fine. "Good. Informative." She looked at him for a moment. "You're letting people underestimate you," he shrugged. "People underestimate me whether I let them or not." "That's different," she said. "There's a difference between not being seen and choosing not to correct someone's wrong count." He was quiet for a second. The light through the trees had shifted, and now it was more evenly distributed, the gold gone out of it, just regular morning light. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not calculating, not careful, just the look of someone who has been understood in a way they didn't anticipate and wasn't sure what to do about it. "I've got a mission debrief at 10, he said. "I know." She picked up her water bottle. "I'll be gone tomorrow." She was almost to the tree line when he said behind her, "If you found out something about someone, something that could hurt them or could be used against them, what would you do with it?" She stopped walking. She didn't turn around immediately. "That depends," she said, "on who they are and what they are to you." "What if they're neither? What if they're just someone?" She thought about the wall between the waiting room and the room with the flat voice. She thought about 3 years. She thought about Gara at 12, sitting in his own darkness. "Then the question isn't what you do with the information," she said. "The question is why you're asking me." She walked into the trees without turning around, and behind her the training ground was quiet except for the sound of autumn wind moving through the branches overhead, and Naruto didn't say anything else. She counted that as its own kind of answer. She spent the rest of the morning doing what she'd planned, drafting correspondence, organizing her notes from the border agreement meeting, eating a late breakfast at the inn. She wrote a preliminary report for the Sooner Intelligence Division, encrypted it, and then held the finished document over the small oil lamp on the writing desk and burned it. She wrote another one, more selective. What she'd observed about Konoha's defensive positioning, what she'd confirmed about the patrol agreement timeline, a brief note about Uzumaki's combat development that was accurate but contained none of what mattered. She encrypted that one and placed it in the outgoing secure mail. Then she sat back and thought about what she was doing. She was a shinobi of Suna. She had sworn to serve her village and protect its interests. Withholding strategically valuable intelligence from the Intelligence Division was, by the technical definitions in the Suna Mission Code, insubordination at minimum and treason by a generous reading of the more aggressive provisions. She knew this. She held it clearly and turned it over and looked at it from several angles. The Elder Council would take what she'd heard and use it. Not to protect anyone, not to expose corruption, they would use it as leverage. Against Konoha in negotiations. Against Root as a bargaining chip or a threat. Against Naruto himself, potentially, if it became politically expedient to have control of the question of what Konoha intended to do with its Jinchuriki. They had done this kind of thing before. They had done it with Gaara. They had done it with Suna's own Jinchuriki before Gaara, and that had ended in a death that the Elder Council still referred to in official documents as a necessary measure. She was not handing that to them. Not yet, maybe not ever. What she needed was more information. She needed to know exactly how far Danzo's plan had progressed, what the 3 years represented in terms of specific operations, and most critically, what Naruto himself knew about the shape of his situation. Because the difference between a man who knew he was being managed and had chosen to stay anyway, and a man who was being managed without his knowledge, was the difference between a choice and a trap, and those two situations required entirely different responses. She thought about what he'd asked in the training ground. If you found out something about someone, what would you do with it? He hadn't been asking abstractly. She'd bet her entire professional reputation on that. Naruto asked abstract questions the same way he moved through the market district, like a small, localized weather event. This had been careful, deliberate, aimed. He knew something was wrong. Maybe he knew quite a lot. He just didn't know the full shape of it yet. She thought about telling him directly, sat with that for a while, turned it around. Number not yet. Not in Konoha, surrounded by the infrastructure of the situation, where any conversation could be observed by exactly the people she needed him not to run at immediately. Because Naruto, when he decided something needed to be addressed it the way she opened a fight, moving forward, not around. She needed him to wait. She needed to understand the full architecture first. And she needed to figure out why, of all the calculations available to her, the one she kept returning to was the one where she told him. She was still chewing on that last part when she packed her bag, settled her account with the inn, and walked to the gate the next morning. The Chunin guard who stamped her out wished her a safe trip back to Suna in the same cheerful tone they'd used when she arrived. She thanked them. She walked through the gate. She didn't look back. Behind her, Konoha went on being exactly what it appeared to be, and completely something else underneath, and the wind off the plateau pushed against her back like it was trying to tell her something. She already knew. She just hadn't decided what to do with it yet. Chapter 2. What sand keeps the Elder Council of Suna met in a room that had no window? Temari had always thought this was telling. Konoha's leadership conducted its business in rooms with views. You could see the village from the Hokage office, see the streets and the people and the ongoing consequence of every decision made inside those walls. Suna's council sat in stone and lamplight, and the absence of outside reference, which made it very easy to make decisions about the world without having to look at it. There were 5 of them today. Elder Yura, who was oldest and spoke least, and whose silences carried the most weight. Elder Haku, whose specialty was trade agreements, and who had the pleasant manner of someone who genuinely enjoyed the work of making things difficult for other people. Elder Maru, Suna's intelligence director, compact and still in his chair with the patience of a man who had spent 40 years waiting for information to become useful. The 2 remaining were newer appointments, elevated after the reorganization that followed Chiyo's death and Gaara's installation as Keizukage, both of them young enough to still be making themselves, still calibrating how much ambition to show in a room with the older 3. Gaara was not in this meeting. That was not an accident. Temari sat across the low table from the 5 of them with her hands flat on the surface, and her fan leaned against the wall behind her, in a room lit by 4 oil lamps that turned everyone's face a slightly amber color and made the shadows long and editorial. She'd requested this meeting herself, which was unusual. She normally reported through the standard written channels, with occasional personal briefings when the material warranted. Requesting a direct audience with the full council suggested material that warranted. She gave them the border agreement details first. All 5 of them listened with varying degrees of attention. Haku with genuine interest, because border agreements intersected with his trade work. The 2 younger elders with the careful attention of people taking notes for later. Maru with the stillness of someone waiting for the real information. Yura with closed eyes and an expression that could have meant profound attention or profound sleep. The agreement finalizes the Northern Patrol rotation, she said, with the Eastern Quadrant transitioning to joint operation by the first month of winter. Konoha's chakra relay stations along the border will be shared access from that point, which gives our scouts a communication advantage we didn't have before. Satisfactory, Haku said, better than the previous cycle. The previous cycle was negotiated poorly, Temari said. I've attached a full breakdown. She moved on. She talked about Konoha's current leadership dynamics, the visible tension around the Hokage decision-making on troop deployment, a few observations about which Jonin were being assigned to which mission categories. Solid, useful material, nothing that touched the wall between 2 rooms. Then she stopped, seemed to consider, and said, "There's one additional item." Maru's attention sharpened. She felt it from across the table like a drop in air pressure. "I overheard a partial conversation during my visit," she said, "through a wall unintentionally. I want to be clear about the conditions. I cannot confirm the identities of both speakers with certainty, and I only have approximately 8 minutes of what was clearly a longer discussion." She watched them lean in, all 5 of them. Even Yura opened his eyes. "It concerned the Konoha Jinchuriki," she said. "Uzumaki Naruto. Specifically, an internal Konoha operation that appears to be managing his development, his access to the Nine Tails' power, his psychological conditioning, his operational deployment outside the awareness of the Hokage's office." The room was very quiet for a moment. "Which faction?" Maru said. "I believe Root." One of the voices was addressed as Danzo-sama. Another silence, different quality, heavier, the sound of 5 people doing math simultaneously. "How far along?" Yura said. He had a voice like gravel rearranging itself at the bottom of a dry riverbed. The conversation referenced a 3-year timeline to a decision point about whether Uzumaki becomes, positioned correctly, or becomes, in their words, a variable they can't afford. "Meaning they'd move to neutralize him," Maru said. "That was my interpretation." Haku leaned forward and steepled his fingers, and she recognized in his expression the thing she'd been expecting and dreading in equal measure. The light that came on in certain people's eyes when information transformed in real time from raw data into opportunity. "This is significant," he said, with the pleased tone of a man who had just been handed something he didn't know he needed. If Konoha's leadership is fractured on the question of their own Jinchuriki, and if Root is operating outside Tsunede's sanctions, it creates leverage, the younger elder on the left said, with slightly too much eagerness. "Leverage," Temari repeated carefully. "Against Konoha, certainly." Haku was already moving through it. She could see the calculations running. But also, if managed correctly, against Uzumaki himself, his cooperation in future joint operations, his positioning relative to Suna in any future conflict. A Jinchuriki who knows his own village is planning to neutralize him is a Jinchuriki with reasons to look elsewhere for allies, the younger elder finished. Temari looked at Maru because Maru was the one she respected most in this room, not because she liked him, but because he was honest about what he was doing. He met her eyes and she saw him reading the thing she was being careful not to show on her face. "You're uncomfortable," he said. "I'm precise," she said, which was what she always said, and which meant in this context I have concerns I'm choosing not to raise yet. "The Kazekage will need to be informed," one of the younger elders said. "The Kazekage," Yura said, in a tone that settled the room like a hand pressing down on a table, "is informed of what affects his duties. The political applications of intelligence material are within the Council's purview. Meaning, Gara didn't need to know. Temari kept her expression exactly where it was. "I'll prepare a full written report for the Intelligence Division's files," she said. "I'll note the conditions of acquisition and the confidence levels on each data point." "Good." Haku sat back with the comfortable air of someone who'd gotten what they came for. "In the meantime, is there an active communication channel with Uzumaki? A plausible pretext for contact that wouldn't raise flags in Konoha?" She thought about a training ground in autumn morning light, a question asked at her back as she walked away. "Not currently," she said. "We may want to develop one." Haku smiled at her pleasantly. "You handled the border negotiations well, Temari. Your rapport with Konoha counterparts is an asset." She understood exactly what he was suggesting she do with that asset, and she smiled back at him with the same pleasantness and felt something behind her sternum go cold and flat and very decided. "I'll look into it," she said. Gara found her on the roof of the administrative building that evening, because Gara always found her when something was wrong, and she had stopped being surprised by this years ago. He moved without sound, had always moved without sound, even before the sand became a second skin for him, some quality of his attention making the space around him quiet. He sat on the ledge beside her and looked out over the village with the particular quality of presence that was distinctly his, not peaceful exactly, but settled, like a landscape that had stopped apologizing for being what it was. The sun was going down behind the dunes to the west, and the sky was doing the thing it only did over Suna, that layered amber to purple gradient that lasted maybe 20 minutes and made everything look like it had been painted by someone with a dramatic sensibility and no sense of restraint. "The council meeting went long," he said. "They had things to discuss. You gave them something significant." It wasn't a question. She looked at him sideways. "What makes you say that?" "Because you asked for a direct audience instead of written channels." He kept his eyes on the horizon. "You only do that when you want to watch their faces." She turned back to the sunset. "I heard something in Konoha, something about an internal operation. I reported it. And now you're on the roof." "I'm often on the roof. After meetings you're fine with, you go home and eat and sleep." He said it without accusation, just the factual observation of someone who had been studying her patterns her entire life and found them useful. "After meetings that leave something unresolved, you come up here." She was quiet for a moment. The last light was thinning at the western edge, the stars beginning to define themselves in the east. "They want to use it," she said. "Whatever I found, as leverage. That's what intelligence is for, from their perspective." "I know that." She turned the fan over in her hands. She'd brought it up here reflexively, the same way other people carried worry beads. "It's who they want to leverage it against that I'm thinking about." Gara looked at her then, and his eyes were pale green and completely attentive. "Naruto," he said. She didn't confirm it, she didn't deny it, but her hands stilled on the fan. "He saved your life," she said. "In the broad sense, whatever you are now, the path to it ran through him." "I know. I'm not sure the council appreciates how that changes the math." Gara was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, it was with the measured weight of someone who had learned the hard way that words had consequences, and had chosen to stop being careless with them. "If someone were maneuvering against Naruto," he said, "and you were in a position to prevent it, what would you do?" "I'd prevent it, even if it complicated things for Suna." "Some things are more complicated to live with than others," she said. He turned back to the horizon, and in the expression on his face, not approval exactly, more like recognition, she saw the same thing she'd felt in herself since she'd walked out of Konoha's gate. The absolute clarity that came when you stopped trying to choose between two wrong options and just decided to find a third one. "Be careful," he said, which was his way of saying I understand and I trust you and please don't die all at once. "I'm precise," she said. He didn't smile, but something near his mouth decided not to be entirely still. 3 days later, the mission orders came through. A joint intelligence assignment, Suna Konoha, coordinating a response to an Akatsuki-connected cell that had been operating near the Wind Country border, gathering information, disrupting supply lines. A B rank that had the distinct possibility of becoming an A rank if the cell turned out to be larger than the initial scouting report suggested. It was exactly the kind of assignment that generated natural cross-village contact without raising flags. She recognized Maru's work in the paperwork. He'd moved quickly. The Konoha-signed shinobi were listed in the briefing document. She ran her eyes down the short list and stopped at the second name. Uzumaki Naruto, Jonin, of course. She wasn't surprised. She should have been surprised. The coincidence was almost theatrical, but she thought about Maru's deliberate stillness and Haku's steepled fingers and the pleasantly calculated way he'd said your rapport with Konoha counterparts is an asset, and she understood that this was not coincidence. The council had gone through Konoha's joint mission pool and selected the assignment that would put her in the field with Naruto specifically. They wanted her to develop the channel. They'd arranged the geography of it. She read the briefing document twice, packed her mission kit, left a note for Kankuro that said only border mission, back in a week, and which he would correctly read as don't do anything I'd have to fix while I'm gone, and reported to the mission departure point at dawn. The Wind Country border was a different landscape than the deep desert rock here, with scrub vegetation that managed to survive the dryness by being comprehensively unambitious about its own existence, thin-leaved and low and determined. The Akatsuki cell's last known position was 3 days' travel northeast, near a canyon system that Temari knew from previous assignments as good cover territory, multiple exit routes, elevated sightlines, the kind of place a small unit with good information and no particular ideology beyond profit would choose as a base. She arrived at the rendezvous point, a way station 2 hours east of the border checkpoint, to find that the Konoha contingent had arrived first. 2 Jonin she didn't know well, a woman named Ai with a sensor specialty, and a man named Riku who moved with the deliberate precision of someone trained in genjutsu interception, both of them sitting on the way station's low stone wall drinking from canteens and looking at a map. Naruto was sitting on top of the way station's roof, eating something wrapped in paper, looking out at the landscape with the expression of a person who has a great deal of energy and is putting it somewhere productive while waiting. He looked down when she arrived. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she said, because that was the register he'd set and she matched it without thinking about it. He dropped from the roof in one easy movement that covered about 4 meters of vertical distance and landed beside her without visible effort. He glanced at the 2 Konoha Jonin and then back at her. "You bring anyone? 2 San Jonin, Ryaiko and Sen, they'll be here in an hour." They were tracking a side lead. She unrolled her copy of the briefing. "Their scouting report has the cell at 12 to 15 members, but the supply line disruption suggested more coordination than that number should be able to manage. Either the count is wrong or they have external logistics support." He looked at the document over her shoulder without asking, which she noted was a habit of his. He moved into your space to engage with information rather than waiting to be handed it. External support points to someone backing them, not just Akatsuki-affiliated but Akatsuki-funded, possibly, or they have a local network we haven't mapped. She traced a route on the map with one finger. "I want to run a reconnaissance pass through the eastern approach before we move on the main position. The canyon's eastern entry is lower ground, but less visible from the elevations where they'd post lookouts." "Lower ground means less wind cover for you," he said. She looked up. He was looking at the map, not her, but she could tell he'd thought about it, specifically about how she fought, specifically about terrain variables that would affect her specifically. She filed that away. "I can work with reduced range," she said. "Or we go in from the north," he said, "which gives you the elevation you need and gives me a straight line to the main position if things go loud. Ai can hold the sensor perimeter. Riku and your 2 can handle the approach from the west, so they're moving away from us if they scatter." She looked at the map. He was right, the northern approach was tactically better. It also wasn't the route in the briefing document, which meant he'd already been thinking about this, already looking at the terrain and finding the better line. She thought about the training ground, the Rasengan he'd redirected, the way he'd pushed through her wind wall not because he was reckless, but because he'd calculated that it was the faster solution. "North it is," she said. Ai looked up from the stone wall with a mildly intrigued expression. "You 2 sorted that out quickly." "We've worked together before," Naruto said, which wasn't entirely true. They'd fought alongside each other once, during Akatsuki's earlier operations, and they'd sparred 3 days ago in Konoha, but they'd never run a structured mission as co-leads. He said it with easy confidence anyway, and she realized he was giving her something, establishing a working dynamic in front of the team that made her role clear. She didn't acknowledge it verbally. She did adjust her assessment of him by a few degrees. Her two Sunajanin arrived 40 minutes later, which was 20 minutes ahead of schedule, Rieko, sharp-eyed and economical in her movements, with a specialty in explosive seals. And Sen, who had the deceptively casual posture of someone who'd been fighting longer than his age suggested, and had learned to conserve energy the way desert creatures conserved water. Temari briefed them both quickly while Naruto talked through the approach with Ai and Riku, and then the six of them moved out into the late afternoon with the canyon system a day's travel ahead. They didn't talk much on the move. This was correct field behavior. Sound traveled differently in open country and you learned to ration it. But somewhere in the third hour, when the light had gone flat and the stars were beginning to show and they'd stopped for a water break at a dry stream bed that would run again in winter, Naruto sat down across the depression from her and said, quietly enough that it didn't carry to the others, "Did you think about what I asked?" "In Konoha," she looked at him. In the failing light, his face was harder to read, the whisker marks more pronounced, the eyes quieter. "I thought about it," she said, and I said the question was why you were asking me." She held his gaze. "I still want to know the answer to that." He was quiet for a moment. He picked up a small stone and turned it over in his fingers. "Because you're not from here," he said finally. There's no reason for you to cover for anyone, and you're not." He stopped, started again. "I figured if anyone would give me a straight answer, it'd be someone who didn't have anything to protect by lying." She thought about Elder Haku's hands steepled together in lamplight. About leverage said with pleasant enthusiasm. "What is it you think you know?" she said. He set the stone down. "Pieces," he said. "I've had pieces for a while. A Jonin I trusted said something once about the mission assignments I get, how they're not random, how someone makes sure I'm always in the field when there's a certain kind of threat." He paused. "And there was a period when I was 16 when I knew something was off, communications that didn't arrive when they should have, responses that were delayed in ways that didn't make sense for the distance." He looked at her directly. "I know that someone has been shaping the edges of things. I just don't know how far in it goes." She held very still for a moment, the way she had in the waiting room. "Further than you know," she thought, "all the way in." "Why haven't you asked Tsunade?" she said. "I have," something in his voice, not bitterness exactly, more like a very old frustration that had been there long enough to become furniture. "She gives me the version she knows, I think, which isn't all of it." "What makes you think she doesn't know all of it?" "Because if she knew all of it," he said, "she'd be angrier than she is." Temari sat with that. Around them, the other four shinobi were eating or resting with the efficient quietness of experienced field operatives, and the desert was settling into the particular cold clarity of a night-time without cloud cover, stars enormous above the flat land. She made a decision. Not the full decision, not yet, not out here on a joint mission with 4 other people present and an Akatsuki cell 1 day ahead of them, but the first piece of it. "When this mission is done," she said, "and we're back at the way station before we separate, I want to have a conversation." He looked at her steadily. About the pieces," she said, "and what fits where." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might push for more, and she was already sorting through how much to give if he did. But he just nodded once with the gravity of someone who had been waiting for an answer and had just been told the answer existed. "Okay," he said. She looked back up at the stars. The cold off, the desert was coming up through her coat now, and she pulled it tighter across her chest. And she thought about the shape of what she was doing, not yet committing to any course of action, not yet deciding anything irrevocable, just maintaining the information and the relationship that would make the right decision possible when the time came. That was the lie she told herself. The truth was simpler and more inconvenient. She had already decided, sitting on a rooftop in Suna with her brother's pale eyes watching the last light go out of the western sky, and everything since had been her moving carefully toward the thing she'd already committed to. She was going to tell him, not because Suna needed her to, not because Konoha deserved it, because she had stood in a stone room with no windows and watched 5 people discuss how to use a person the way Suna had used Gara, and she was not going to do that again, not while she had the information and the position to choose differently. The cold deepened. She didn't sleep that night. She took the second watch because she wanted to be useful, and because the alternative was lying awake waiting for morning, and she preferred to be moving. The canyon was a day ahead. The Akatsuki cell was somewhere in it. Naruto slept 4 meters away with the uncomplicated depth of someone who had made peace with sleeping in uncertain places. And the stars moved overhead with the indifference of things that would still be there regardless of whatever happened next. The canyon in the morning was copper-colored and deeply shadowed, the walls so close in places that 2 people walking side by side would have to angle their shoulders. The cell had established themselves in a widened section about a kilometer from the eastern entrance, a series of natural alcoves reinforced with basic construction, stores of supplies, the remnants of a chakra suppression array that AI detected from 400 meters and flagged. "Modified design," she said quietly, crouched at the canyon edge above the position. "It's not standard Akatsuki. Someone added to it." "External support," Temari said, and caught Naruto's eyes. He nodded slightly. "How many?" he said to AI. 11 inside the alcoves, 2 on high ground." AI pointed. "There and there. Good positions. They'd see a ground approach from either entry before you got within range." "Not from above," Temari said. She looked at the canyon walls. Sandstone layered, with enough irregularity that you could move along the top edge if you were careful about your sightlines. The 2 lookout positions were both focused on the canyon floor, which was natural. The threat model they'd built their defense around was a ground assault. She was not a ground threat. "Give me 5 minutes to get to position," she told Naruto. "When you hear wind, move." He looked at the canyon wall, calculated the climb time, looked back at her. 3 minutes, he said, not a challenge, a genuine counterproposal. "I want to move before they have time to process what's happening up top." 3 minutes, she agreed. She went up the canyon wall with the fan strapped across her back, using her hands and the wind jutsu she could run at low output to push herself silently along the rock face. The stone was warm from the morning sun and rough enough for good purchase, and she moved quickly, not recklessly, but with the economy of someone who had done worse climbs in worse conditions and had never found it particularly interesting to be slow about it. She reached the top, moved to position over the first lookout, a man in a dark vest sitting with his back to the wall and a clear view of the eastern approach, and pulled the fan into her hands. 1 rotation, 1 clean cut of compressed wind that arrived before the sound did. The lookout slumped without a noise. She was moving to the second position before the first man hit the ground. Covering 30 meters of canyon rim at a run while down below, she heard the sounds of Naruto's approach. Not careful, not subtle, the deliberate noise of someone making sure that all the attention in that canyon came toward him. The second lookout was already turning when she reached the position. She used the handle of the fan, not the blade of wind, faster at close range, and he went down with considerably less ceremony than the first. Below, the sounds of a fight resolved quickly. 11 people were not a trivial number, but 11 people caught between a sensor nin who'd already mapped their positions, 2 experienced Suna Jonin coming from the west, and Naruto Uzumaki arriving through the front with enough force to rearrange the geography slightly, turned out to be a solvable equation in about 6 minutes. She watched from above for the first 2 minutes, identified the 3 fastest threats, and used the wind to remove them from the equation systematically before dropping into the canyon proper to handle the remaining 4 who'd managed to find good cover positions. When it was done, the canyon was very quiet and slightly dusty, and the morning was still young. Naruto was standing in the middle of the widened section, hands on his knees, breathing with the controlled rhythm of someone who had been working hard and knew how to manage it. He looked up when she landed, did a quick visual accounting of her, no injuries, full mobility, fan in hand, and straightened. "Clean," he said. "The suppression array modification," she said. "I want to get AI to document it before we move the bodies." "Already on it." He nodded toward where AI was crouched over the array with a careful expression and an ink pen. He looked back at Temari, and in his eyes was something she recognized, the specific clarity that came after a fight well executed, when the body was still running hot and the mind was briefly uncomplicated. "You moved fast," he said. "I heard 2 hits in about 8 seconds. The second was close, I had to improvise. But you didn't need me to cover the rim." "Number," she met his eyes. "I said I wasn't gentle about it." He smiled, one of the real ones, not the reflexive brightness he carried around like a torch. This one was quieter, fewer teeth. She looked at it for half a second longer than was professional and then looked away at the suppression array. "Document the whole site," she told the team. "We're here so we're thorough." She spent the next hour being thorough, which kept her hands busy and her mind on the work, and she did not think about smiles or 3-year timelines or what she was going to say at the way station tomorrow. She thought about it anyway. They reached the way station as the sun went down behind the western dunes, and the amber light hit everything again with its characteristic lack of subtlety. And Sen and Ryuko settled in with the professional ease of people who knew how to make a camp out of minimal resources. And Ai and Riku wrote their incident report with the quiet efficiency of a well-matched team. Naruto found her outside, sitting on the stone wall with the last warmth of the day still in it, looking at the route back to Suna with an expression she wasn't trying to manage. He sat down beside her, not close, not far, just present. She took a breath. "Danzo Shimura," she said. "Do you know who that is?" He went very still, not tense still, the kind of stillness that came from deciding not to perform a reaction. "I know the name," he said. "He has an operation running," she said, "specifically regarding you, your development, your deployment, your—" She paused, chose the word carefully. "Your architecture." He said nothing. She could feel him listening with his entire attention. "I heard part of a conversation in Konoha, through a wall unintentionally." She told him what she'd heard. Precisely, without editorializing, dates, words she was certain of. Context she was inferring, clearly labeled as inferent. She gave him the whole thing, and she watched his face while she did, because his face told the truth whether he intended it to or not. What she saw was not surprise. Not exactly. It was the expression of someone hearing the map drawn over a territory they'd already been walking blind. The specific recognition of this is what all of it was. When she finished, the desert was fully dark and the stars were up, and the way station lanterns threw warm circles on the stone. "He said the letters were redirected," Naruto said. His voice was even, completely even, which told her more than any other register would have. "That's what I heard." "From who?" He didn't specify. He was quiet for a moment. "When I was 16, there was a period when," he stopped, started again differently. "Jirya sent me 3 letters in 1 month. I got the first one. The other 2 I thought just didn't arrive because the routes were disrupted during the Akatsuki movement." A pause. "Or that's what I decided at the time." She said nothing. She let him work it. 3 years, he said. "That's what he said. That's the timeline he referenced." He looked out at the dark desert, and his profile in the lamplight was still, and his hands rested on his knees, and she watched the information settle into him the way a large stone settled into water, not a splash but a deep displacement, everything rearranging around it. "Why are you telling me this?" he said. It was the right question. She had been waiting for it. "Because you asked me what I'd do," she said, "if I found out something about someone. And I told you it depended on who they were to me." She turned to look at him fully. "You're not anyone to me, not specifically, but you're what happens if people like Danzo get to keep making decisions uncontested, and I've already watched that story once, and I have no interest in watching it again." He turned to look at her. His eyes were very blue in the lamplight. "Gaara," he said softly. "Gaara," she confirmed. Something moved through his expression, not gratitude, not relief, something older and quieter than either of those. The look of someone who had spent a very long time being seen in parts and had just been seen whole. "Okay," he said, and then, after a moment, "So what do we do?" Inside the way station, the others were talking and eating, and the mission was, by all official measures, complete. Outside, the desert was dark and cold, and full of the particular silence of a landscape that kept everything. Temari looked at the stars, thought about a room with no windows and 5 calculating faces, Thought about Gara at 14 and Gara now, and the distance between those two things measured in years, and in one loud, persistent, infuriating boy from Konoha who had refused to do the math the way everyone else was doing it. "We do it carefully," she said, "and we do it completely." She looked back at him. Danzo's operation doesn't get managed or negotiated with, it gets dismantled. He looked at her for a long moment. "Yeah," he said, and there was something in his voice that she would have called relief if it had been anyone else, something that had been held tight for a long time, letting go one careful degree. "Yeah, okay." The lamplight made the stone wall warm between them, and the stars were extraordinary out here away from any village. And Temari thought about the report she hadn't filed and the chain of decisions that had led here, and she decided, for the first time since Konoha's gate, that she was entirely sure she'd made the right call. Chapter 3. The weight of wind. The message arrived in Suna 4 days after Temari returned from the border mission. It came through the standard intelligence channel, encrypted, properly formatted, bearing Elder Maru's seal. And it found her in the middle of a training session on the Western practice grounds, where she'd been running wind compression drills for 2 hours in the late morning heat. The kind of focused repetition that she used to think rather than avoid thinking. The courier was one of Maru's people, a young woman with careful eyes and no particular expression, and she handed Temari the scroll without comment and left the same way she'd arrived. Temari unrolled it with dusty hands. The message was brief. Maru didn't believe in unnecessary words, which was one of the things she respected about him and one of the things that made him dangerous. Everything he said had been edited for maximum effect. Asset confirmation received from secondary source. Uzumaki intelligence validated. Council has authorized a preventive measure regarding the subject. Operation is internal and does not require your participation. Standard deniability protocols apply. Your continued cultivation of the contact is appreciated. She read it twice. Then she rolled it back up and held it in her fist and stood in the middle of the practice ground with the desert sun hitting the back of her neck and thought about what preventive measure meant in Maru's vocabulary. She already knew what it meant. She'd known before she finished the first sentence. It meant the Elder Council had decided that Naruto, as a potential future point of conflict, as someone who now represented a variable they couldn't control, as someone who might, if Danzo's operation succeeded, become a weapon pointed at Suna, needed to be addressed before the situation resolved itself in Konoha's favor. Preventive measure. Authorized operation. Internal and does not require your participation. They'd sent a team, without telling her, without telling Gara. She was already moving before the thought finished forming. She found Maru in his office 20 minutes later because she didn't bother with an appointment, and the 2 guards at his door looked at her face and made the correct decision to step aside. She pushed the door open and walked in and dropped the scroll on his desk with enough force that his tea rattled. He looked at the scroll and then at her with the unhurried patience of someone who had been expecting this visit. "When did the team leave?" she said. "This isn't your operation, Temari." "When?" He set down his pen. "Yesterday morning." She did the math fast. A day's lead, traveling light, moving toward the Wind Country border where a joint mission had recently been completed and where Naruto was now heading back to Konoha alone. She'd confirmed his return route herself during the mission debrief, noted it as standard procedure, filed it in the mission report that Maru's division would have received within hours. She'd handed them the route. The understanding of that landed with a particular weight. "Who authorized this specifically?" she said. "The council, I've already told you. Was the Keizukage informed?" A pause that was a fraction too deliberate. "The Keizukage office was notified of an intelligence operation in progress." "That's not the same as the Keizukage being informed." She put her hands flat on his desk. "Maru, who is on that team and what are their orders?" He looked at her for a long moment with the evaluating stillness that had made him effective at his work for 4 decades. She could see him calculating whether she was a problem to be managed, whether she was an asset being repositioned, whether the cost of telling her was higher or lower than the cost of not telling her. 3 operatives, he said finally. Capture priority, lethal authorization if capture is compromised. The goal is leverage, not elimination. He paused. Unless the situation requires otherwise. Unless the situation requires otherwise, she repeated. The subject is a Jonin with a biju sealed inside him, Temari. The team is prepared accordingly. The subject, she said, and she kept her voice flat and professional because the alternative was something she didn't have time for right now, defeated Akatsuki S-rank operatives at 17. Your team's preparation is irrelevant. What's relevant is that this operation is going to fail. It's going to fail badly. And when Konoha finds out that Suna sent an unauthorized assault team after their Jonin on Wind Country soil, we will lose the border agreement, the joint patrol rotation, and whatever goodwill we have left after the Sand Sound invasion, which was not that long ago and which people in Konoha have not forgotten. Maru was quiet. Beyond the political consequences, she said, and now something in her voice had an edge she wasn't entirely controlling. If that team goes in with lethal authorization and something goes wrong, Gaara would be difficult, Maru said evenly. Gaara would be worse than difficult. She stood up straight. He would be right. Another silence, longer this time. She picked up the scroll from his desk. I'm going after the team, she said. I'm going to stop this before it happens, and then I'm going to come back and have a conversation with the full council about what information-based strategy actually looks like when it doesn't blow up in everyone's faces. She tucked the scroll into her vest. If the council wants to issue a formal countermand, they have about 6 hours to do it before I'm out of communication range. She was at the door when Maru said, Temari. She stopped but didn't turn. Council will view this as interference with an authorized operation. The council, she said, can view it however they like. She left. She found Gaara in the Keizukage office on her way to the equipment room because she made the deliberate choice to find him rather than leave him without information, which was what the council had done and which she had decided she wasn't going to replicate in her own behavior. She told him in 3 sentences. Operation authorized, team deployed, she was going to stop it. Gaara sat behind the Keizukage desk, which he occupied with the complete lack of self-consciousness of someone who had earned something rather than inherited it, and he listened to the 3 sentences, and then he was quiet for roughly 4 seconds. You have a route estimate, he said. They left yesterday morning from the Eastern Depot. If they're moving at standard field pace, they're somewhere in the scrubland corridor, maybe 8 hours from the border checkpoint. You'll need to cut across the secondary dunes to intercept. He opened a drawer, pulled out a small sealed document, held it out to her. Keizukage Authority. If anyone questions your operation in the field, show them that. She looked at the document, looked at him. You already knew something was moving, she said. I knew the council was meeting without me 3 times in a week, he said. That's usually a sign. He held the document steady. Take it. She took it. She was almost to the door again when he said, be careful, which was what he always said, and then which was not what he always said. Both of you. She didn't answer that. She put the document in her vest next to Maru's scroll, and she ran. The secondary dunes were miserable in the afternoon. There was nothing poetic about crossing secondary dune terrain. No dramatic sweeping vistas, no clean desert light, just an irregular series of rises and falls in loose sand that resisted efficient movement and made every kilometer cost 2 kilometers of effort. She ran the ridgelines where she could, using her fan to push herself across the gaps between crests, burning through chakra at a rate she'd regret later if this went long. She caught up to the team in the scrubland corridor at roughly 3 in the afternoon, which meant she was ahead of her own estimate, which meant they were moving faster than standard field pace. That told her they were motivated, which told her the council hadn't just authorized this, they'd prioritized it. There were 3 of them. She recognized Jun immediately. He was one of Suna's better mid-range operatives, a puppet user who'd worked under Kenkuro's division and who was, by pure technical assessment, very capable. The other 2 she knew by reputation. A censor named Dai who specialized in tracking chakra signatures through environmental interference, and a woman named Roya whose record in the field was exceptional in ways that the intelligence division found useful precisely because they weren't the kind of exceptional that got talked about openly. 3 good operatives against Naruto. She dropped off the dune crest in front of them and they all stopped dead because nobody came off a dune crest at that speed without intent. Jun's hands moved toward his ceiling scroll before he registered who it was. "Temari-san, stand down," she said. All three of them looked at her with the careful non-expression of professionals receiving an order from someone who wasn't their current operational commander. "We have authorization," Roya said. "Not aggressive, factual. Presenting the relevant information. You have authorization from the council." Temari held up the sealed document Gara had given her. "This is authorization from the Kazekage office, which supersedes the council's operational mandate." Dai looked at the document, looked at the other two. "The council," Temari said, "authorized an operation without informing the Kazekage. That's a procedural violation and you know it. Whatever you were told about chain of command on this one, you were told wrong." Jun was the one who'd worked with her the most. She could see him sorting through it, not the political angle, because he wasn't that kind of thinker, but the practical angle. He was good at his job because he was honest about what his job was, and his job was to follow the right orders, and right now 2 sets of orders were in conflict, and one of them had the Kazekage seal on it. "What's the operational status of the subject?" Roya said. "He completed a joint mission on schedule, took the northern return route, and as of this morning was approximately 1 day's travel from the border checkpoint heading back to Konoha." Temari looked at all 3 of them. "He's not a threat. He's not in motion against Suna. This operation is preemptive aggression against an allied village's Jonin, and if it completes, it ends the border partnership we spent 6 months building." Silence. The scrubland around them smelled like dry sage and dust, and a hot wind came off the western dunes and moved through it with an uncomfortable persistence. "We stand down," Jun said. He looked at the other two. "We stand down and await formal clarification from the Kazekage office." Roya held Temari's gaze for a moment longer. Then she stepped back. "Noted," she said, which was her version of agreement. Temari let out a breath she'd been holding since Maru's office. "Go back to the Eastern Depot. I'll send formal confirmation through the Kazekage channel within 6 hours." They went. She watched until they were over the next dune rise, and then she turned northeast and kept moving. She found Naruto at sunset. He was camped in a shallow draw where a dry streambed had carved a natural windbreak out of the rock, a small fire going because the desert nights were cold, and because he was apparently not concerned about concealment on a return route from a completed mission in Allied territory. He was cooking something over the fire that smelled like it was in the general category of food. He looked up when she appeared at the edge of the draw with the specific attentiveness of someone who had been aware of her approach for the last 30 seconds and had chosen to keep cooking instead of reaching for a weapon. "Temari," he said. "Naruto." She slid down into the draw and crouched across the fire from him. He looked at her, really looked, the way he did when he was reading something rather than just seeing it. "You're not on a mission," he said. "You moved like you were chasing something. And you came from the southwest, which is the Suna direction. Your observation skills are better than advertised. People don't advertise the skills they rely on." He poked at whatever was in the pan. "What happened?" she told him. Straight through, no soft approach, because he deserved the straight version and because she didn't have the energy for any other version. The message from Maru, the team, the route she'd inadvertently handed them in the mission report, the confrontation in the scrubland. He listened without interrupting, which was harder for him than it looked. She could see the effort of it in the stillness he was maintaining, the way his hands stayed deliberately occupied with the pan. When she finished, the fire crackled, and the desert was going from amber to purple to dark around them. "They had lethal authorization," he said. "Capture priority, lethal if capture was compromised." He nodded slowly. "And you stopped them?" "Yes," he looked at the fire. "Why?" She had answered this question at the way station. She had the same answer now, and it was still true, but sitting here in a draw in the middle of the desert after running 4 hours across dunes to intercept a kill order, the answer felt different than it had sounded before. Less analytical. More like something she'd done with her hands. "I already told you why," she said. "You told me the reasoning." His eyes came up from the fire. "I'm asking about the part before the reasoning. The part that made you move before you'd worked out all the logic." She looked at him. The firelight was doing something to his face that made him look older, not tired, just more present than usual, the brightness turned down and something quieter underneath it visible. "Gara," she said, and then, "And you're not Gara, but the arithmetic was the same." He held her gaze. Something in his expression shifted, not softened exactly, because Naruto was not a soft person underneath the warmth, but opened, like a door that had been shut for a practical reason and was now being reconsidered. "Thank you," he said, "just that." She looked away at the fire. "Don't thank me yet. I've created a significant political problem for myself. The council. The council is going to have opinions." She pulled her coat tighter against the cold that was coming in fast now that the sun was down. "Maru will probably reframe it as me going rogue on an authorized operation. Haku will use it as a reason to push the Kazekage for more aggressive policy regarding Konoha. Will Gaara push back? Gaara has the document I showed your team. He covered me." She paused. "But covering me politically and preventing the council from moving in a different direction are different problems." Naruto was quiet for a moment. "You're going to have to burn something down," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Probably. Okay." He sounded almost cheerful about it. She looked at him sharply and he shrugged, an honest gesture. "I've been living with the understanding that something needed burning for about 2 years. It's less scary once you've named it. What's been stopping you? I didn't have enough of the picture." He met her eyes. "Now I've got more." She thought about what he'd said at the way station, pieces, and what she'd given him since, the shape of Danzo's operation, the confirmation of a 3-year timeline, and now this. Proof that the information was already in play beyond Konoha's borders, that Suna's council had moved on it within days of her return. "We need the full picture," she said. "Not pieces. The complete architecture of what Danzo is running, the personnel, the specific operations, the connection points to Konoha's official structure. Without that, we're reacting." "I know where to start looking," he said. "Where?" "There's a man named Sai," he said, "who used to be Root. Full disclosure, complete cooperation. He defected about 2 years ago and I trust him, but I haven't pushed him hard on operational specifics because I didn't want to compromise his position." His jaw set. "I'm done not pushing." "Sai," she said, filing the name. "What else?" "Kakashi knows more than he's told me, I'm sure of it." He poked the fire. "He's protecting me, which I understand, but right now being protected from information is more dangerous than the information. Tsunade is the Hokage. What she knows and what she can act on are different things. Danzo has political protection from the council, the same way your council covered this operation from Gaara." He looked at her. "But if we can put the full architecture in front of her with enough corroboration that she can move on it officially." "She acts," Temari said. "She acts," he confirmed. She thought about the shape of it. Not a direct assault, not yet, but information gathering, source development, building a case comprehensive enough that it couldn't be dismissed or buried. 2 people working from different sides of the same picture, with access to different pieces. "This is going to take time," she said. "Yeah, and during that time, Danzo's timeline keeps moving." "Yeah," he didn't look troubled by this. "But he thinks I don't know, and he thinks you reported to your council like you were supposed to." He looked at her. "Which means we have the advantage of him not knowing what we're doing." She thought about that. He was right. The asymmetry of information right now favored them. Danzo knew that the Suna Intelligence Division had the information, but he didn't know Temari had stopped the operation or told Naruto the details. The council thought she was developing a contact. Maru thought she was running an intervention to protect a political asset. Nobody had the full picture of what was actually happening, which meant the full picture was, for a limited and valuable window, theirs. "Eat something," Naruto said, which was such an abrupt gear change that she blinked. "What? You ran 4 hours across secondary dunes." He held out the pan. "There's enough for 2. She looked at the pan. It was some kind of dried meat and reconstituted vegetables, the standard field ration prepared in a way that suggested limited interest in the culinary process. She was, she realized, genuinely hungry. She took the pan. They ate in a companionable quiet that she hadn't expected and didn't examine too carefully, the fire between them and the desert dark and enormous around the shallow draw, stars pressing down on the sky with the intensity they only had out here away from any light source. "When I get back to Konoha," he said at some point, "I'll talk to Sai, and I'll talk to Gaara. Formally, he needs to know everything." She handed the pan back. "He's also going to want to help." "Good." Naruto stacked the pan away. "Gaara's scary when he wants to be." "Gaara is always scary," she said. "He's just gotten better at not performing it." Naruto smiled, one of the real ones again. She was starting to be able to identify the real ones reliably, which was information she chose not to think about the implications of. "I'll be in touch through the secure channel we used for the border agreement," she said. "Coded, routed through the Joint Mission Records system so there's legitimate traffic to explain it." She stood, brushed sand off her coat. "Response window of 48 hours. If I haven't heard back within 48 hours of anything I send, I'll assume there's a complication and adjust." "Same on my end." He looked up at her. "What do I call this? If someone asks why I'm in contact with a Suna liaison, tell them we're coordinating follow-up on the Border Mission Intelligence Report," she said. "The Canyon Cells Support Network. It's legitimate and it gives us a reason to share information." "Smart." He paused. "I knew you were the one to ask. I told you not to thank me yet." "That wasn't thanks." He met her eyes, and there was something in his expression that was neither gratitude nor calculation, nor any of the things she'd catalogued from him so far, something more direct than all of those and simpler. "I meant that I was right to trust you." She stood with that for a moment. The wind came off the desert with its dry, ancient indifference, moving through the scrub at the edges of the draw, and the fire shifted in response to it. And she thought about trust as a concept. She had always handled the way she handled fragile things in the field, carefully, with both hands, with the full understanding that dropping it had consequences. "Get some sleep," she said. "You've got a day's travel to the checkpoint." "What about you?" "I'll camp at the streambed crossing 2 kilometers north." She picked up her fan. "I need to send Gara the formal confirmation tonight." 2 kilometers north at a streambed crossing," he said, as if committing it to memory. "And Temari." She paused. "If the council sends another team," he said, "I'll deal with it myself. Don't burn yourself down over it." She looked at him for a moment in the firelight. "You let me decide what I burn," she said. He held up both hands in a gesture of concession that was slightly too cheerful to be entirely innocent. She climbed out of the draw and walked north through the dark, and the fire behind her dwindled to a small amber point in the enormous dark. And she thought about the word trust and the specific quality of the way he'd used it, not as an expectation, but as an observation, the way you'd note that the sky was clear or the wind had shifted. She'd been trusted before, by Gara, by her team, by the village in the abstract way that public service required. But this was different in a way she couldn't fully articulate, something about the absence of condition in it, the way he'd said it the same way he thanked the ramen chef, not because it was strategic, but because it was simply the current true thing. She filed that thought with the care she gave to all the things she couldn't fully articulate. Later, when she had time. Right now, she had a message to send, and a return trip across secondary dunes and a council to face. She arrived back in Suna the next evening to find that Elder Haku had already submitted a formal complaint about her field intervention to the Keizkij's office, which she had expected, and that Elder Maru had not, which she had not expected. She spent the evening with Gara going through the formal channels, lodging her own counter-report with the appropriate seals and language, establishing on paper the procedural case that what she'd done was correct, and what the council had attempted was a violation of the Keizkij's operational authority. Gara handled the political machinery with a precision she found both admirable and slightly terrifying. He had learned the forms of leadership the way he'd learned everything, by understanding it completely and then doing it with absolute commitment, and watching him dismantle Haku's complaint in a 3-hour meeting with the council, using their own procedural language against them with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world, was a masterclass in how power worked when it was genuinely held rather than borrowed. By the end of the meeting, the operation had been officially suspended pending Keizkij review. Temari had been issued a formal notation of commendation for correct procedural escalation, and Elder Haku had the look of a man who had played a card he'd expected to be winning and found it over-trumped. She went home and slept for 10 hours. When she woke up, there was a message in the Joint Mission Records channel, coded, brief. It said, "Contact established. First layer mapped. When can we talk properly?" She decoded it, deleted the encoded version, and sat at her writing desk in the early morning with the deciphered message in her hands, and felt the momentum of what was moving, slow but certain. The way a wind built before a storm, nothing dramatic yet, just the quality of air changing. She wrote back, "Give me 3 days to stabilize the home front, then we talk properly." She sent it and went to make tea and thought about architecture, not the psychological kind that Danzo built, the kind designed to keep people performing without knowing they were in a structure, but the physical kind, the load-bearing kind, the kind you dismantled by finding the keystones and removing them in the right sequence so the whole thing came down without burying anyone you wanted to protect. 3 days. Then they'd start pulling stones. Chapter 4. Fire doesn't ask permission. The message that changed the timeline arrived on a Wednesday. Temari was in the middle of a strategy review with Gaara's senior advisors, border security projections, nothing urgent, the kind of meeting that existed because administrative continuity required it, when the courier appeared at the door with the kind of controlled urgency that meant the message was time-sensitive without being actively on fire. She excused herself, stepped into the corridor, broke the seal. It was from Naruto. Through the joint mission channel, coded properly, but the content was compressed in the way his messages got when he was moving fast and didn't have time to be thorough. Sai confirmed deeper than expected, not just observation, active intervention in 6 deployment decisions over 18 months. One of them was Jiraiya's last mission. Need to move now. Can you get to Fire Country border checkpoint by Friday? She read it twice. Then she folded it very precisely and put it in her vest and went back into the meeting and spent 45 minutes completing the security review without giving any outward indication that anything had changed. Jiraiya's last mission. She'd read the intelligence reports on Jiraiya's death. Everyone in the Shinobi intelligence community had, because Jiraiya had been the kind of operative whose loss rearranged the strategic landscape, whether you liked it or not. The official account was Pain, the Akatsuki leader, a fight that had been genuinely too large for any single person to survive regardless of circumstances. That account had always been accepted because it was credible on its face and because there was no obvious alternative. If Sai was saying that a route operation had influenced the deployment decisions that put Jiraiya in the field at that time, in that configuration, with that intelligence support, she thought about Naruto's voice in the desert, completely level, saying the letters were redirected. The specific flatness of someone receiving a hit they'd been bracing for without knowing what shape it would arrive in. One of them was Jiraiya's last mission. She understood now why he'd said need to move now. This wasn't abstract leverage anymore. This was specific. This was something that could be proven, documented, put in front of people who had the authority to act, and it was the kind of thing that, if Danzo realized they had it, would accelerate whatever he was planning dramatically. The 3-year window was no longer the relevant timeline. She was at the mission desk within an hour of the meeting ending, filing a standard border coordination request, follow-up intelligence on the Canyon Cells support network, as established, fully legitimate, covering the real reason she was going to the Fire Country checkpoint by Friday. She sent Naruto one line back, Friday morning. Bring everything Sai gave you. She left Thursday afternoon to make the timing work. Traveling light with just her mission kit and 2 days of field rations, and the kind of focused forward energy that she recognized in herself as the state she operated best in. When the variables had resolved into a clear problem with a clear solution, and all that remained was execution. The Fire Country checkpoint was a small fortified way station at the border crossing, staffed jointly by Konoha and rotating allied personnel, mostly used for coordinating cross-border intelligence and managing the administrative requirements of joint operations. It had a private briefing room, secure communication channels, and the significant advantage of being technically outside both Konoha and Suna's direct jurisdictional reach, which made it useful for conversations that benefited from geographic neutrality. Naruto was already there when she arrived Friday morning, which meant he'd traveled overnight, which meant he'd read Need to Move Now and meant it. He was in the briefing room with a spread of documents on the table that made her immediately stop in the doorway and assess, not a few pages, but a significant operational file, organized with the kind of meticulous care that did not match Naruto's general presentation and therefore came from someone else. "Sai did this," she said, touching the edge of one document. "Sai did this," Naruto confirmed. He was standing across the table from her, and he looked like he'd traveled through the night and processed something large and difficult and come out the other side still standing, which she was beginning to understand was just what he looked like when things were serious. He had records, physical records he'd kept as a kind of insurance back when he first came over from Root. He didn't know what to do with them. Yamato-sensei told him to keep them somewhere safe and wait for the right time. Yamato knew Sai had records. He didn't know the full content. Naruto's jaw worked briefly. "Neither did I." She moved to the table and started reading. Naruto let her. He didn't summarize or direct, just waited. And she appreciated that more than she would have said out loud, because it meant he understood that she needed to form her own picture rather than receive his. The documents were a combination of Root internal reports and Sai's own handwritten observations, the latter written in the spare, emotionally neutral style of someone who had been trained to document without editorializing, and had not fully shaken that training even after leaving the organization. Together, they laid out an operational structure that was elegant in its design and nauseating in its implications. Root had been running what the documents called Jinchuriki Optimization Protocol, which was exactly what Danzo's voice through the wall had described: managed development of Naruto's power and psychological conditioning. But the documents gave it specificity that the overheard conversation hadn't. 6 deployment decisions over 18 months, each one designed to expose Naruto to progressively more demanding combat scenarios, while ensuring that the emotional stakes were high enough to push his Biju integration. 3 separate operations where Root's embedded intelligence had been deliberately withheld from Konoha's official mission, planning to ensure Naruto operated without the support structure that would otherwise have prevented the specific kind of near-death situation that accelerated his Nine-Tails access. And then the 7th entry, the one that was different from the others not in kind, but in scale. The deployment intelligence for Jiraiya's final mission had been routed through a Root operative who had access to Pain's movement data, accurate data that had been in Root's possession for 3 weeks before it was passed to Jiraiya. Passed in a form that was technically complete, but strategically shaped to remove 2 options that would have changed the engagement parameters. Without those options, Jiraiya had gone in the way he'd gone in. Not set up to fail, exactly, because Jiraiya against Pain had always been a question of scale rather than competence. But the information architecture around the mission had been constructed to ensure that if Jiraiya didn't survive, Naruto would receive the news in a specific emotional context that Root had prepositioned. The grief was the point. The grief in Danzo's optimization model was useful. She put the document down and looked at the wall for a moment. "He weaponized it," she said. "Yeah." Naruto's voice was quiet and absolutely steady, and she looked at him and understood that he had been sitting with this since Sai had given him the files and had done whatever work he needed to do with it before this meeting, because he was not going to be incapacitated by it when there was something to do instead. She felt something in her chest that was not quite admiration and not quite protectiveness, and was probably some compound of both that she didn't have precise language for. "This is enough," she said. "This is enough to take to Tsunade. It's enough to destroy Danzo's political standing if it's presented correctly," he said. "But the council that protects him, the Konoha elders, Koharu and Hamura, they've been his insulation for 30 years. Tsunade can move against him if she has this, but the council will slow the legal machinery, buy him time to bury evidence, call it fabricated." He spread his hands on the table. "We need to hit the operation directly, not just the paper evidence. The infrastructure," she said. "Root has active sites, not the main training facility that's too visible, but the relay stations they use for information handling, the operative network, the communication architecture." He looked at her. "Sai knows where 2 of them are. There's a third that he has partial intelligence on. a safe house in the northern district of Konoha that Danzo uses for direct meetings that don't appear in any official record. She thought about it. Hitting the relay stations takes out his communication network and denies him the ability to coordinate a response. Hitting the safe house takes out his operational records and cuts off whatever he's running that doesn't exist on paper. Both of those things need to happen before Tsunade gets the documents, he said. Because the moment she moves officially, Danzo goes to ground. If we've already dismantled his infrastructure, he has nowhere to go. She looked at the document. How long to pull this together? Sai can guide us to the relay stations. He knows the shift rotations, the personnel counts. The safe house is the harder target. Danzo has it defended and he's smart enough to vary his pattern. He paused. But I have an idea about the safe house. What kind of idea? The kind that involves you being somewhere very visible doing something completely legitimate, while a version of me that nobody will be able to officially confirm was there handles the safe house interior. She stared at him. Shadow clone, he said, and the corner of his mouth moved. I can run 5 of them simultaneously in full operational capacity for about 2 hours, long enough. And the real you. The real me is at the relay stations with Sai. She thought about the logistics. You'd be running 3 separate operations simultaneously. I'd be running 3 separate operations simultaneously, he confirmed, and said it with the complete lack of drama of someone describing a thing they were capable of and had chosen to be honest about. No performance, just fact. She thought about the training ground, the wind wall he'd pushed through, the reserves visible in his movement. She thought about how carefully he'd not shown her the ceiling. 5, she said. Easy 5, 10 if we don't need them at full capacity. She looked at the table. The documents, the operational picture, the 3 targets. We need a 4th problem solved, she said. What? Suna, she looked up. Maru's operation is suspended but not closed. If I move on Konoha targets, even to dismantle a corrupt organization, and it comes out before the official case against Danzo is established, Suna looks like it was running a covert operation against Konoha, he said. Which is the opposite of what I've been trying to prevent. She tapped the edge of one document. I need Gaara formally read into this before we move. Official Keizukage sanction for a joint operation targeting a rogue Konoha intelligence structure. That way Suna's participation is allied action, not espionage. Can you get that authorization in time? Gaara is fast when it matters. She was already drafting the message in her head. Give me until tonight. I'll send through the secure channel. Naruto nodded. Tonight. He looked at the documents and then at her. I want to be clear about something. Go ahead. Once we move on this, once the infrastructure is hit and the documents go to Tsunade, there's no version where this ends quietly. Danzo will know it was me. The council in Suna will know you went outside your authorization. Both of us are going to be standing in front of people who are angry. I know. I just want to make sure, Naruto, she looked at him directly. I stopped a sanctioned kill team with a direct order from my Keizukage. I'm already standing in front of people who are angry. The question has never been whether I'm going to face consequences. The question is whether the consequences are for something worth having done. She held his gaze. This is worth having done. He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, a single decisive motion, and reached across the table and picked up the most critical documents and started organizing them into a sequence. Okay, he said, let's build the plan. They spent 4 hours in the briefing room and they were, Temari reflected at some point in the 3rd hour, genuinely good at this together. Not because their styles matched, they didn't. She planned from the outside in and he planned from the problem outward. She built contingencies and he built momentum, but because those approaches were complementary rather than conflicting. Where she put structure, he put energy. Where he saw the fastest line, she saw the 2nd and 3rd lines if the first one failed. By the time they were done, the table was covered in a working map of Konoha's northern district, annotated mission notes, 3 contingency branches, a communication protocol, and 2 completely empty teacups that had arrived at some point and been consumed without either of them consciously registering it. The relay stations are lower risk, she said, reviewing the final version. Standard extraction. Sai guides, you move fast, get in and get the operational records and get out. I don't need to be there for those. Agreed. The safe house, your shadow clone needs to move between the rotation windows, which Sai puts at 40 minutes maximum before someone confirms the interior. She traced the timing. 40 minutes is tight. I've done more with less. I know you have, she moved on. While the safe house is being accessed, I need to be visible. Officially visible, a joint mission check-in works, somewhere with documentation. If anyone traces the timing later, I'm on record elsewhere. The checkpoint here has a log, he said. If you're registered as present for a follow-up briefing, it timestamps automatically. She looked at the checkpoint documentation on the edge of the table. That works, she paused. The document package to Tsunade needs to be delivered before your shadow clone disperses. Timing, Sai will deliver the package directly to the Hawkage's office. He's Konoha personnel with legitimate access and a reason to be there. He knows what to say and what to give her. Naruto's expression was complicated briefly, something between trust and guilt, the look of someone who was pulling a person back into the line of fire and knew the cost of it. He volunteered, he added. He understands what this is. He understands that it's what should have happened 2 years ago, and he's been waiting to be asked. He looked at the map. Sai's fine. He's better at this than he looks. She thought about the documents, the emotionless, precise handwriting of someone trained from childhood to record without feeling and who had quietly, carefully kept records anyway. Yeah, she said, he probably is. She sent the message to Gaara at sunset. The authorization came back in 2 hours, which was the fastest she'd ever seen official Kazekage paperwork move, and she looked at the document on her scroll with a feeling she identified as it being good to have competent family. Joint operation authorized. Intelligence objective. Dismantling unauthorized Konoha intelligence structure. Parameters, allied action, non-lethal engagement with Konoha personnel unless threatened, full deniability protocols in effect until official case is established. Kazekage sign-off attached. Stay safe. And then in Gaara's handwriting rather than the formal script of official correspondence, a single line at the bottom, tell him I said hello. She showed Naruto because she couldn't quite help it. He looked at the postscript, and something happened to his expression, something large and briefly unguarded, a flash of the thing underneath all his performance, raw and real and gone again quickly. Same, he said, which came out slightly thicker than his regular voice. He cleared his throat. Okay, we move tomorrow night. Tomorrow night was a Tuesday. Temari spent the intervening day doing what she did best, which was thinking through the plan from every angle, finding the places where it was fragile, building solutions for the fragile places. She walked the checkpoint perimeter, confirmed the log system's timestamp function, ate a meal at the way station's small canteen that was better than field rations and worse than anything she'd get in Suna, and let herself be seen by the 3 staff members on duty in ways that would be memorable if anyone asked later. In the evening, she sat on the checkpoint wall and watched the fire country border in the last light, the tree line visible to the east, the open ground between, the way the 2 landscapes met and negotiated something in the space where they touched. Naruto appeared beside her at some point, dropping onto the wall with that 4-meter vertical drop means nothing ease, and they sat for a while without talking, which was something she would have said 2 weeks ago was not possible for him and was revising her assessment of. When I was a kid, he said finally, I used to think that being Hawkage meant everyone would stop looking at you like you were the problem. He picked up a small stone and turned it over. Like if you got to the top of the thing, retroactively everything before it would make sense, would be worth it. Does it still look like that? He threw the stone, watched it arc and land in the dirt below. Now it looks like you're responsible for the thing, which is different from being rewarded by it. You're responsible and you have to protect it, and sometimes protecting it means burning down the parts of it that are wrong. He was quiet for a moment. Danzo thinks he's protecting Konoha. He believes it, she said. Yeah, that's what makes it hard. He looked at the tree line. He's not wrong that Konoha needs strength. He's not wrong that a Jinchuriki who can't control their power is a catastrophe. He stopped. He's decided that the person inside the problem is less important than the problem, she said. Yeah. He said it simply without heat, which told her the anger had been processed earlier and what remained was just clarity. I've met a few people who do that. It always ends the same way. the person they decided didn't matter, ends up being the only thing that actually mattered. She thought about Gara, who had been a problem to be managed for 15 years and was now the most effective Keizkage Suna had produced in 2 generations. She thought about the wall between the waiting room and the room with the flat voice. After tomorrow, she said, things are going to move fast. I know. Konoha's political situation is going to be difficult for a while. Tsunade will move on Danzo, but the cleanup is going to take months. You're going to be at the center of it, officially and unofficially. I know that too. I'm going to have to deal with my own council. She looked at the tree line. Haku isn't going to let this go easily. Maru will adjust, he's pragmatic, but Haku is going to push for another approach, another way to use what we know, something that serves Suna's interests more obviously. What will you do? I'll do what I always do, she said. I'll be more prepared than he is and more precise than he expects, and I'll take the conversation somewhere he didn't plan for it to go. He looked at her sideways. Has that always worked? Not always, she admitted, but often enough that I keep trusting the method. The last light was completely gone now, and the checkpoint lanterns were the only source, warm and immediate in the dark. Temari! He said her name in a way that made her turn to look at him. Whatever happens after, if Konoha gets complicated, or Suna gets complicated, or both get complicated at once. He paused like he was finding the right words, which was unusual for him, and the effort of it showed in the way he held his jaw. I know you did this for reasons that make sense on your own terms. I'm not asking for anything because of it, but if you need something, if there's a problem I can help with, I want you to ask me. She looked at him. The lamplight made it hard to be ambiguous about what she saw on his face, which was genuine and uncomplicated and entirely without motive. She held it for a moment. The same applies, she said. He nodded. Something settled between them, quiet and solid, the way agreements did when they were made between people who meant them. Tuesday night arrived with a clear sky and a wind out of the northeast that Temari tracked with professional attention. At precisely 11, she settled into the checkpoint's log system and registered herself as present for a follow-up intelligence coordination. Time-stamped, countersigned by the duty officer, entered into the permanent record. She sat in the briefing room with a fresh pot of tea and the Canyon Cell documents and worked methodically through them, making notes, being thoroughly, documentably present. 40 kilometers north, inside Konoha's border, Sai moved through familiar streets with a package of documents pressed flat inside a mission scroll, and the particular expression of someone who had been waiting a long time to do the right thing, and was finding the actual moment of it less cinematic and more deliberate than he'd imagined. In the northern district, a shadow that moved like Naruto without quite being Naruto went through a rotation window with 22 seconds to spare and found what it was looking for in the safe house's lower level. 10 years of parallel records, operational logs, the paper skeleton of a structure that had been making decisions about people without their knowledge or consent, organized in the precise manner of a man who had never doubted that what he was doing was correct. The shadow clone took what mattered and left what didn't, and was gone before the rotation closed. In 2 separate locations on Konoha's eastern edge, relay stations went dark one after the other with the systematic efficiency of someone who understood information architecture well enough to remove exactly the right nodes. The real Naruto was back at the checkpoint by 1 in the morning, arriving in the briefing room with the specific energy of someone who has just completed something large and is still running the adrenaline. He sat down across from her, put a sealed scroll on the table, and looked at her with clear eyes. "Clean," she said. "Clean." He pushed the scroll toward her. "The safe house records. I figured Suna should have a copy." She looked at the scroll. "Danzo will know someone was in there. By the time he knows, Tsunade will already have the package." He looked at the teapot. "Is there more of that?" She poured him a cup. He drank it with the grateful urgency of someone who had been running on chakra and forward momentum for several hours, and she watched the adrenaline settle in him gradually, the bright edge energy becoming something more sustainable. Her message channel pinged. She opened it. From Sai, package delivered. She's reading it now. She showed Naruto. He read it and let out a long, slow breath that wasn't quite a sigh. "Now we wait," he said. "Now we wait," she confirmed. Outside the checkpoint, the night was still and clear, and the border between fire country and wind country lay quiet in the dark. Unremarkable from the outside, everything decided. She thought about the elder council sitting in their windowless room. She thought about Danzo in his safe house, not yet knowing that the floor had been removed from under it. She thought about Tsunade at her desk reading documents that would make her angrier than she'd been in years. She thought about the specific satisfaction of a plan executed correctly, not the excitement of motion, but the quieter thing after it, the clean feeling of having done the thing you set out to do. Naruto was looking at the table with the expression she was learning to recognize as him being fully present in a moment instead of already inside the next one, rare for him and notable. "You know what I keep thinking about," he said. "What?" "The letters," he said. "Jirya sent me 3 letters in 1 month and I got one of them." He turned his cup in his hands. "The other 2 were probably just normal things, updates maybe, checking in." A pause. "I keep thinking about the fact that they existed, that he wrote them." She understood what he was saying underneath what he was saying. Not grief exactly, something adjacent to it, something about the shape of what had been there before it was taken. "You would have known what they said eventually," she said quietly, "if none of this had happened." "Yeah," he set the cup down, "but now I know they existed and I know why they didn't arrive and that's," he stopped, "that's different." "Yes," she said, "it is." They sat with that for a while, the checkpoint night quiet around them, the timestamp on the log record ticking steadily forward, everything documented, everything in motion, the structure of what was wrong beginning to come apart at the seams they'd found and pulled. Chapter 5. Everything That Burns. The fallout from Tuesday night arrived in waves, and Temari had planned for waves, but the first one came from a direction she hadn't mapped. It came from Orochimaru. She found out on Thursday morning, 2 days after the checkpoint, when she was back in Suna dealing with the political consequences of her council intervention and Gaara's formal authorization, both of which were proceeding more or less as expected, Haku angry, Maru recalibrating, Yura silent in the specific way that meant he was deciding something, and a message arrived through a channel she didn't recognize. Not the joint mission system, not any of the standard intelligence route. A private channel, hand-delivered by a courier she'd never seen before and couldn't immediately place in any organizational context she knew. The scroll was unmarked, except for a small symbol pressed into the seal wax that she recognized after a moment's thought as a medical research notation, specifically the kind used by independent contractors outside the village system. She opened it carefully, checking for seals or traps first because receiving an unmarked scroll from an unknown courier was the kind of thing that killed the incautious, and found a single page of clean, elegant handwriting. "Temari of the Sand, you have been busy. So have I. The conversation you overheard in Konoha was not private by accident. Danzo wanted it in play. He wanted Suna to know. The question was always how you would use the information. You chose incorrectly, from his perspective. From mine, you chose exactly right. I would like to discuss what comes next. I am currently in a position to offer you something that neither Konoha nor Suna can, and I believe you are in a position to understand why that offer is worth hearing. The messenger will wait for a response." Oh, she sat very still for a moment. Then she stood up, walked to the window, looked out at Suna's streets in the morning light, and thought about what it meant that Orochimaru was watching this situation closely enough to know what she'd done and had moved fast enough to reach her with a message 2 days after the checkpoint operation. She thought about the seal wax symbol, medical research, independent, which was a way of saying that whoever O was currently working through, it wasn't any of the existing village power structures, not Sound, which had collapsed after the war, not Akatsuki, which was scattered. Something newer, something that had positioned itself in the gap that the dismantling of those structures had left. She wrote 1 line on a fresh piece of paper. "I'm listening, come to me," folded it, sent it back with the courier. Then she sent an encrypted message through the joint mission channel, "New variable, significant, call it S-rank and historic, need to speak today." Naruto's response came in 40 minutes. Not through the channel, through the window. He dropped onto her windowsill from the rooftop above, which was a 4-story building, and she didn't startled because she'd been half expecting something like this since she sent the message. But she did put her hand on her fan reflexively before she registered who it was. "You could use the door," she said. "Faster this way." He was through the window and into the room in one smooth movement, looking alert and slightly like he'd been traveling since before dawn. "S-rank and historic, what happened?" She handed him the scroll. He read it. His expression didn't change much, a slight narrowing of the eyes, a tension at the jaw, but she could see the processing happening underneath it. When he looked up, his eyes were very clear. "Orochimaru," he said, "that's my read. He's been operating independently since Sound collapsed. There have been reports. Tsunade gets intelligence on him semi-regularly, nothing actionable." He looked at the scroll again. He knew the conversation in Konoha wasn't private by accident. He's saying Danzo staged it. Danzo wanted the information in play in Suna, she said. He wanted leverage with the Suna Council, probably hoping they'd approach him directly with a partnership proposal. Use Naruto as a bargaining chip between Suna and Root. Cut Tsunade out of the equation entirely. He didn't account for you doing what you did with it. Number, she took the scroll back. He also didn't account for Orochimaru watching. She looked at Naruto. "Orochimaru says he has something to offer that neither village can. He wants a meeting. He's offering to help dismantle Danzo, or he's offering to use this situation to position himself." She looked at him steadily. "Those two things might currently be the same offer with different long-term implications." Naruto was quiet, working through it. She watched him think and appreciated again the things she'd noted in the training ground, the way the surface performance dropped away when he was serious, and what appeared underneath was considerably more than the surface had advertised. "What does Orochimaru gain if Danzo goes down?" he said. "Root's network is one of the most comprehensive information structures in the shinobi world," she said. "If it's dismantled officially, that network doesn't disappear, it fragments and becomes available. Orochimaru positioning himself as a broker in that fragmentation is worth significant strategic capital. And if he brokers it before Tsunade can formalize the dismantling, he controls the terms," she finished, "which is a form of power that doesn't require him to fight anyone." "That's why he's moving now," Naruto said, "before Tsunade acts on the documents." "How long does Tsunade need?" she asked. He pulled a folded message from his vest. She noted it was already written, which meant he'd been managing multiple threads before this conversation. "Kakashi sent me this last night. Tsunade has the documents. She's confirmed their authenticity through 2 independent sources, and she's preparing a formal inquest. The council, Koharu and Hamura, are already pushing back, calling it fabricated intelligence from a hostile source." He paused. "She needs a week, maybe 10 days, to build the formal case to a point where the council can't obstruct it. Orochimaru won't wait 10 days. Number, he looked at the window, the street below, back at her. Where does he want to meet? He said come to me, which means he's coming here, somewhere in or near Suna." Naruto processed that for a moment. "He's making a statement about his reach. He's making a statement about his confidence," she said. "There's a difference." She set the scroll on the desk. "I want to hear what he has to offer before we decide whether we use it, reject it, or turn it against him. And if he's not offering anything real, if this is just him inserting himself into a situation to cause disruption, then we learn what his current capabilities are, what he thinks we need, and what he believes is available to him that we don't have access to." She looked at Naruto. "Intel from a meeting you choose to walk out of is still intel." He held her gaze for a moment and then smiled, quick and sharp and real. "You approach everything like it's a training exercise." "I approach everything like it has a solution," she said. "That's different." He moved toward the window. "I'll be here when he comes." "I assumed." He paused on the sill. "Temari, Tsunade sent me a separate message." He said it carefully, the carefulness itself a signal. "She's moving faster than 10 days. The documents from the safe house, there was something in them about an active operation, not historical, current." She felt the air in the room change. "What operation? I don't have the full detail. She's restricted the information until she has secure channels established." His jaw was set, but she used the word imminent. "How imminent?" "She didn't say." He looked at her from the window. "Which means very." Orochimaru came that evening. He arrived without the performance she'd half expected, no dramatic entrance, no escort, none of the theatrical excess that was part of his established reputation. He simply appeared at the door of the room she'd designated for the meeting, a small private space in the administrative building's lower level, and he looked like someone who had been operating carefully and anonymously for a long time, and had gotten very good at taking up only the space he chose to occupy. He was older than she remembered from the intelligence files, though older was complicated with Orochimaru, given his particular relationship with the question of age and physicality. His eyes were the same, flat gold, intelligent, processing everything in the room with the detached attention of a researcher examining a specimen. He looked at her, then at Naruto, and something crossed his expression, not surprise. She didn't think he was capable of genuine surprise, but something like approval of a correct prediction. "You brought him," he said to Temari. "Was that not the expectation? It was the hope." He sat down across the table with the ease of someone who had no concerns about the room's defensibility, which either meant he was genuinely unconcerned or had already established that he was safer here than anywhere else available to him. She didn't discount either option. "I'll be brief because I think brevity serves all of us. Danzo's active operation, the one Tsunade has now identified as imminent, is not directed at Konoha." "At Suna," Naruto said, not a question. "At both of you," Orochimaru said. "Specifically, at the alliance you've been building over the past 3 weeks, which he has been watching with significantly more attention than either of you appears to have accounted for." His eyes moved to Temari. "When you stopped his team in the scrubland, he had an observer on the ridge who confirmed your identity and your direction of travel. He knows you went to Naruto. He doesn't yet know the full scope of what was shared, but he has made a reasonable inference." Temari thought about the dunes, the ridge line above the scrubland corridor. She'd checked the approaches, but she'd been moving fast and focused on the team ahead, not on elevated observation positions behind. She filed the self-correction and moved on. "He's moving to collapse the partnership before it becomes an established fact," she said. "He's moving to create a situation that forces both of you to respond to your respective villages' political needs rather than to each other." Orochimaru folded his hands on the table. "There is an intercepted communication. I have the original, not a copy, between Danzo and a contact inside Suna's Elder Council, in which the specific mechanics of a provocation are discussed. A staged incident near the border, attributed to Konoha, severe enough to force Gaara to demand official explanation and suspend joint operations." Naruto looked at Temari, looked at the table. "Which council member?" she said. "Elder Haku," Orochimaru said. She felt something cold move through her chest and settle. She had known Haku was ambitious, and she had known his response to the failed operation had been too smooth, the pivot too fast from anger to renewed interest, but she had assessed him as opportunistic rather than active, reactive rather than initiated. She had miscounted. "When is the staged incident scheduled?" Naruto said. His voice was completely level. 3 days from now, the border checkpoint on the eastern approach, the same way station you used for your recent operation." Orochimaru looked at him. "There will be a Konoha patrol unit in the area on a legitimate mission. The framing will be designed to make their presence look like a provocation. There will be casualties." He paused. "Suna casualties, specifically, from a sand patrol unit that will be in the area because Haku will have arranged for them to be there." The room was quiet. "He's sacrificing Suna personnel," Temari said. "He is creating a political reality that serves Danzo and himself simultaneously. Danzo regains his leverage over the Jinchuriki question. Haku positions himself as the council member who identified Konoha aggression and called for a hard response." Orochimaru said it with the neutral tone of someone describing a weather pattern. "It's competent as these things go. You have the intercept," Naruto said. "Why bring it to us instead of taking it directly to Tsunade or Gaara?" Orochimaru looked at him with something approaching genuine interest. "Because Tsunade and Gaara are the second move," he said. "You two are the first. The intercept changes the situation only if the situation is changed before the incident happens, and changing the situation before the incident happens requires people who can move without official authorization, Without the 3-day documentation process that formal escalation requires, and without the political constraints that Hawkage and Kazekage operate under. He tilted his head slightly. I believe that describes your current operational status accurately. Temari looked at him. What do you want for this? He smiled, and it was a real smile in the technical sense. It reached his eyes, but what it reached them with was the satisfaction of someone who had been playing a longer game than everyone else in the room and was enjoying the moment of revelation. I want to be part of the conversation that happens after, he said. Not an official role, not a pardon, not reinstatement. I want to be consulted, occasionally, on matters of specific expertise by people who have demonstrated they can think past the institutional answer. He looked between them. The shinobi world is reorganizing. The structures that managed it for 50 years are failing. I would prefer to be useful to whatever comes next rather than irrelevant to it. You want a matter, Naruto said simply. Something shifted in Orochimaru's expression, not offense, something more complex. I want to be correct about what the future looks like, he said. I have been wrong about many things. I would like to be right about this. Naruto was quiet for a moment. He looked at Temari. She looked back, and they had the specific wordless exchange of people who had spent enough time in high-stakes situations together to compress a full conversation into a 3-second look. She gave him a slight nod. Give us the intercept, Naruto said to Orochimaru. We deal with the border situation. After we'll talk about after. Not a promise, Orochimaru said. Not a promise, Naruto confirmed. But not a number. Orochimaru reached into his sleeve and placed a sealed document on the table. The intercept is authenticated. You'll see the methodology on the second page. The patrol unit that will be positioned at the border is the 3rd Sand Reconnaissance Squad, which is currently on a standard rotation mission that will bring them into range on schedule. He stood. The Konoha Patrol is Team 12. They don't know they're being used as a prop. He left the way he'd arrived. No performance. Just the door opening and closing and the absence of him where he'd been. Temari picked up the intercept and read it. Naruto read it over her shoulder. The handwriting in the original communication was meticulous and neat, Haku style, which she recognized from 20 official documents, and the content was exactly what Orochimaru had described, laid out in the careful language of someone who believed in precise agreements. I need to talk to Gaara tonight, she said, and I need to warn Team 12. He was already calculating. If they're pulled from the route before the incident, Haku will know his operation was compromised, she said. He'll look for the leak. If they're kept on the route, but we control the approach, we control the narrative of what happens at the border. She set the document down and looked at him. We let the patrol arrive. We make sure the sand unit is repositioned before it reaches the kill zone. We document the position of every Danzo-affiliated element in the area. She paused. And then we have a provocation that failed in front of witnesses, with a paper trail that leads directly to Haku and directly to Danzo's coordination. That's not just stopping the incident, he said. That's catching them in the act. That's the difference between Tsunade having documents she has to argue are authentic and Tsunade having a failed operation with living witnesses and a contemporaneous record. She picked up the intercept again. Orochimaru gave us this because he knew exactly what we'd do with it. Naruto looked at her with that expression she was getting used to, the one where he was seeing her fully and not being subtle about it. Yeah, he said, he did. A beat. He's not wrong that the world is reorganizing. No, she said, he's not. She found Gaara in his private quarters at 10 that night rather than his office, because the office had too many people around it at any hour, and this conversation was not for anyone else. She told him about Haku in the direct way. She told him everything since this started, no softening, no strategic sequencing, just the information in full. Gaara sat across from her and listened with his hands flat on his knees and his pale green eyes absolutely still. When she finished, he was quiet for long enough that she thought he might be deciding how to feel about it before he spoke. But when he opened his mouth, what he said was immediate, no performance of deliberation. Positions for the 3rd Sand Reconnaissance. Eastern approach, way station perimeter here and here. She sketched it on paper. We need them repositioned by dawn day after tomorrow. New orders, legitimate mission variation, nothing that looks like a last-minute redirect. I can frame it as a survey mission for the chakra relay expansion. He was already thinking through it. She could see the operational machinery running. They won't question a Kazekage directive for that. He looked at her. The intercept. I'll have Orochimaru's authentication verified independently tonight. If it clears, and I believe it will, we move. Haku, he said the name quietly, and she couldn't tell what was in his voice, which meant several things were in it simultaneously, and none of them were comfortable. He's been on the council for 8 years. I know. He was in the room when we discussed the joint partnership. He was in the room when we discussed Gaara's, when we discussed everything. She said nothing. Sometimes information was at its most truthful in the silence after it was given. I need him not to know we have this until the border incident fails, he said. After that, the investigation is legitimate. Agreed. He looked at the sketch. Then he picked up a pen and added 2 more positions to it with the quiet precision of someone who had spent the last 3 years learning how to protect people by understanding terrain. Here and here as well. If anything goes wrong with the repositioning and the patrol approaches anyway, I want eyes on both exits. She looked at the additions. They were correct. She'd been about to add them herself. The Kazekage office is going to be impossible for the next month, she said. The Kazekage office has survived worse, he said, which was true and also indicated he had made his own peace with the size of what was coming. He looked up. Naruto? He's managing the Konoha side. Tell him. He stopped, and something moved through his expression that was rare for him, the specific vulnerability of someone who owed a debt that was too large for normal language. Tell him to be careful. I know he won't, but tell him anyway. He'll tell me the same thing about you, she said. Gaara looked at her with an expression she recognized as him seeing something she wasn't explicitly saying. He had always been terrifyingly perceptive about her, even in the years when she'd been too afraid of him to be close to him. He'd watched her from the distance she'd maintained and understood her anyway. Be careful yourself, he said. I'm always careful. You're always precise, he said. Those aren't the same thing. She left the room before she had to respond to that. She and Naruto coordinated through the night via the mission channel, tight, fast exchanges, operational details, position confirmations, a choreography built in the dark that had to be solid before morning. He was handling Team 12 through Kakashi, who he'd brought in because Kakashi had the ability to adjust mission routes with legitimate authority and the professional discretion to ask no questions until afterward. She was handling the sand repositioning through Gaara's office. At 3 in the morning she sent, "What's your read on Danzo's direct presence?" His response came back in 4 minutes. He won't be at the border. He doesn't put himself in operational range when he can manage from distance, but he'll have 2 or 3 observers, route operatives embedded in the local civilian population. Can you identify them? Sai is working on it. Give me until dawn. At 5 in the morning, 3 identified. I'm having them followed, not approached. I want to know where they run if it goes wrong. She thought about that. You want to trace the route back to Danzo directly. I want the route documented while Tsunade is building her case. Every piece of evidence that connects the border incident to route connects Danzo to a direct attack on an allied village. She looked at that for a moment. That makes this an act of aggression against Suna, not just an internal Konoha matter. Yes, she understood. If Danzo's operation was documented as aggression against Suna, it wasn't just a political inquest, it was a treaty violation, which meant the response didn't require approval from Konoha's internal council, which meant Koharu and Hamura lost their ability to obstruct. She sent back, "Smart." His response was immediate. "I learned it from someone who's very precise." She stared at that for a moment longer than she should have, then put her scroll away and made tea and did not think about it. Day of. The eastern border checkpoint in daylight was completely ordinary, dry air, the smell of dust and scrub, 2 guards doing their rotation, everything exactly as it should be. Temari was positioned on a rise 400 meters south with a sight line over the entire approach, her fan in her hands, a sand radio tucked against her collar. She'd sent Ryuko and Sen, her two Jonin from the border mission, to confirm the repositioned Sand Patrol's new location 2 hours ago. Confirmed, the third reconnaissance was now conducting a chakra relay survey 3 kilometers east, fully on their legitimate orders, nowhere near the incident zone. Team 12, Konoha's patrol, was approaching from the north on a route that Kakashi had very slightly adjusted to bring them through the checkpoint on schedule, present, visible, legitimate, exactly where Haku's operation needed them to be, and completely unaware that they were in a plan that had been planned for. She heard Naruto's voice through the sand radio, quiet and clear. Observers are in position, all 3, 1 at the checkpoint building, 2 at the northern tree line. Confirmed. She scanned the approach. Haku's contact. Can't see him directly. He'll be off-site, waiting for confirmation. The patrol is 8 minutes out. Yeah, how are you on the sight line? Complete. She looked through the range of her view, checkpoint, northern approach, both tree-line positions. If anything moves, I see it. Good. A pause. How many wind blades can you run simultaneously? Effective range at this distance? 6. I might need you to handle the tree-line positions if the observers try to generate the incident themselves rather than waiting. They'll try it after Team 12 enters the checkpoint perimeter, she said. It's the window where the patrol is visible but not yet through to the other side. Looks like a confrontation from a distance. That's what I thought too. Another pause, shorter. 3 minutes. She breathed steadily and watched the northern approach and felt the wind from the east moving through the scrub with the constant, sourceless energy of something that didn't need a reason to exist. Team 12 came into view, 4 Konoha Jonin in standard gear, moving at patrol pace, unremarkable. They reached the checkpoint, began the entry process with the guard. Routine, normal. One of the tree-line observers moved. She saw it before it resolved into anything. A shift in the light quality near the eastern tree cluster, the kind of micro-movement that came before a jutsu deployment. She had the fan open and the wind blade launched in a single motion that was faster than the thought that preceded it. The compressed air hit the position and the observer came out of concealment by necessity, thrown sideways, catching himself on a tree trunk and turning to run. The second observer broke in the same moment. She hit his position with a lower angle blade that sheared through the scrub cover and sent him flat to the ground. The third observer at the checkpoint building started running south. Naruto dropped from the checkpoint roof. She hadn't even seen him get up there and had the third observer's wrists bound in approximately 3 seconds. Team 12's patrol had hit defensive formation the moment she'd launched, which was the correct response to unexplained wind jutsu, and they held it while the situation resolved around them, professional and patient. What? The patrol lead started. Joint operation, Naruto said from the checkpoint building door, holding the third observer by the collar with the ease of someone carrying something considerably lighter. Sorry for the drama. You're all fine. The patrol lead looked at him, looked at the observer, looked at the 2 figures being collected by Ryuko and Sen, who had apparently arrived at speed from somewhere she hadn't tracked. She watched his expression cycle through confusion, recognition, and the specific resigned acceptance of a Konoha Jonin who had encountered Naruto in the middle of something complicated more than once. Do I file a report on this? He said. That would be great, Naruto said. Include the time stamp. It's important. That evening, with 3 route observers in custody and their documented positions, creating a clear evidentiary line from Haku's intercepted communication to an active operation on Suna soil, Temari sat in the Kazekage office with Gaara and the full Elder Council and laid it out. She didn't perform it. She didn't build toward it dramatically. She just placed the intercept, Orochimaru's authentication, the operational timeline, the custody documents for the 3 observers, and the sand radio log of the entire border incident on the table in front of 5 people, and let the pile of paper do what a pile of precisely selected paper was capable of doing. Haku looked at it for a long moment. His face was completely still. She could see him running possibilities, denial, counterframing, procedural challenge, and she watched each one arrive and get discarded as he worked through the evidence in front of him and understood that the discarding was not something she had forced, but something the evidence itself was forcing. the way a load-bearing structure failed when enough of the right supports were removed. He looked at Gaara. Gaara looked back. "Elder Haku," Gaara said, "you are relieved of council duties pending a full investigation. You will be confined to the administrative quarter and provided with counsel." He said it with the complete flatness of someone who had anticipated this moment, prepared for it, and had no emotional performance to add. Just the statement, the consequence, the authority behind both. "Maru, please ensure the transition." Maru stood without hesitation. She noted that. He had read the direction of this and adjusted, which was what Maru did, which was why he had survived 4 decades of Suna's politics and would survive whatever came next. Haku stood. He looked at Temari once, not with anger, which she had expected, but with something closer to recognition, the expression of someone acknowledging a move that beat theirs. Then he walked out with Maru's people flanking him, and the door closed and the room was very quiet. She looked at the remaining council members. Yura had his eyes open. The 2 younger members looked like they were recalibrating their entire understanding of the room they'd been sitting in. "The investigation will take 3 weeks, she said. Konoha will be conducting a parallel proceeding, joint coordination through the Kazekage office." "Agreed," Gaara said. She found Naruto at the checkpoint way station again at nightfall, because they had both independently decided that the checkpoint was the neutral ground for this, the place between the 2 things, and neither of them had said this out loud, but they both arrived there anyway. He was sitting on the wall she'd sat on before, watching the border. She sat beside him. The night was cold and clear, same stars, same dark expanse of desert to the south. "Tsune'd moved," he said. 6 hours ago. Formal inquest opened. Danzo is under house restriction pending the proceeding." "House restriction," she said. "It's the start. Koharu and Hamura are contesting it, but they're doing it on the record now, which means every objection they make is documented. Kakashi says Tsune'd looks like she hasn't slept in 2 days and is in the best mood she's been in since she became Hokage." Temari thought about the Hokage office, the sake cup in plain sight, the woman who had taken on the job because someone had to and had carried it with the tiredness of someone doing the right thing in difficult circumstances for a long time. "She's been waiting for a legitimate path to this," she said. "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. "The observers are talking, 2 of them quickly, 1 of them slower, but even the partial testimony connects back to Root's operational structure." He turned the stone in his fingers. She'd noticed he did this when he was settling something, the same small gesture. "It's moving, she agreed. "Haku, under investigation, confined." She looked at the tree line. "I didn't see that one coming, not as an active participant. You saw him as opportunistic." He was opportunistic. He was also willing to kill his own people for the opportunity. She felt the cold in the air and didn't move against it. "I keep thinking I understand the full picture, and there's always another layer." "That's the job," he said. "I know." She paused. "Orochimaru." "I know." He turned the stone again. "I don't trust him. But he gave us something real and it worked, and he asked for very little." He set the stone down. "I think he's genuinely interested in what comes next, not because he's reformed, but because he's practical and the old world isn't coming back. He's also the kind of person who collects debts," she said. "Right now he has a small one from both of us." "Yeah," he looked at her. "Is that a problem?" She thought about it honestly. "It depends on what he calls it for," she said. "If it's information-based, consultation, as he said, manageable. If it's operational, I don't run operations for Orochimaru." "I know you don't," she met his eyes, "but he's going to test that boundary eventually. Let him." No hesitation, no performance, just the flat certainty of someone who knows exactly where they stand. "I've been tested by worse." She believed him. That was the thing about sitting next to Naruto. She kept believing him, and not because he was persuasive, but because he was consistent. The same person in every context. The same values visible in every decision. And that consistency was either the most genuine thing she'd encountered in a professional life built on reading people, or the most elaborate performance she'd ever missed. She had stopped thinking it was a performance sometime around the 2nd day on the dunes. The wind moved off the desert and through the scrub between the border markers, and it was cold and dry, and it smelled like stone and open space. She thought about Suna's windowless room and the council meeting where 5 faces had lit up with the specific light of people discovering leverage. She thought about what she'd chosen instead of giving them what they wanted, and what it had cost, and what it had been worth. Everything that burned had been worth burning. "What are you thinking?" he said. She didn't answer immediately. She watched the border in the dark and thought about being asked that by someone who genuinely wanted the answer, not the diplomatic answer or the strategic answer, but the actual one. "I'm thinking it's not finished," she said finally. "No," he agreed. "Danzo is under restriction, not removed. The council proceeding will take weeks. Haku's investigation runs parallel to Konoha's, and both of them can be contested." She looked at the stars. "We've dismantled the infrastructure and triggered the official process and created enough evidence that it can't be quietly buried. But the thing is still standing, just damaged." "Damaged is different from intact," he said. "Yes," she paused. "And now everyone who was managing this from a comfortable distance has to come out and defend their positions on the record." He nodded slowly. "Which is when you see who they really are." "Which is when you see who they really are," she confirmed. They sat with that for a while. The checkpoint was quiet behind them. The border was quiet ahead. In Suna, the Keizukage office was processing an investigation that would reshape its own council. In Konoha, the Hokage office was doing the same. 2 institutions simultaneously looking at the architecture of their own foundations and deciding what needed to come down. It was messy and uncertain, and would be for a long time. She didn't mind messy, she minded preventable. "Next chapter is yours," she said to him eventually. He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "The formal inquest in Konoha. Tsunade will need testimony. You're the primary subject of the operation. You're the one who has to stand in front of the proceeding and give them what you know." She met his eyes. "That part isn't mine to manage. That's you in your village with your Hokage. And you. And I'm in my village doing the same thing." She paused. "But separately doesn't mean alone. The joint documentation means both proceedings draw from the same evidential base. What you say there supports what we've filed here." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was getting better at identifying. The one that appeared when she said something that meant more to him than it would have sounded like to anyone else. She understood why. She was describing a form of having someone's back that was structural rather than personal, built into the record rather than dependent on proximity. And for someone whose experience of support had been systematically undermined for most of his life, that structural version was probably the rarer gift. She hadn't said it for that reason. She'd said it because it was tactically true, but she wasn't going to unsay it. "Yeah," he said, quiet and real. "Okay." The wind picked up briefly. A real gust, not her jutsu, just the desert breathing, and the scrub shook and the stars held steady. And somewhere to the north the tree line was dark and ordinary, and the 3 observers who had sat in it that morning were in a holding facility giving testimony to a formal investigation, and the plan that had put them there was complete. What came next was different work. Slower, harder, less immediate. She was ready for it. Chapter 6, New Wind. The formal inquest opened on a Monday. Temari knew because Naruto sent her a message through the joint mission channel at 6 in the morning that said simply, "It's today, wish me luck." She sent back, "You don't need it." He responded with something that in the coded system translated as 3 words, "I know, still." She folded the message and went to her own version of the same thing. Suna's investigative proceeding into Elder Haku's conduct was formally convened in the council chamber, the windowless room, the lamplight, the same stone walls that had held every political decision the village had made for 2 generations. Gaara sat at the head of the table as Keizukage, which was different from the way he'd sat there during the council meeting where she'd reported her intelligence findings. Then he'd been a participant managing a dynamic. Today he was something more declarative. The chamber felt it. Temari sat to his left. The remaining council members, Yura, Maru, and the 2 younger elders were present. Haku sat at the far end of the table, no longer in a council seat, but in a respondent's chair, with 2 of Gaara's administrative staff flanking him and a Suna legal advocate seated beside him who had the expression of someone doing their professional best in a situation that was professionally straightforward. The proceeding opened with the Keizukage reading the formal charge in the spare, precise language of Suna's legal code. Unauthorized coordination with a foreign intelligence operative. specifically one under sanction review, resulting in an active operation targeting Allied village personnel on Wind Country territory. Haku listened with his hands folded on the table and his expression arranged into the carefully neutral presentation of someone who had decided, at some point in the last 48 hours, that his best remaining option was dignity. Temari gave her testimony first. She told it the same way she'd been telling things throughout all of this, directly, without dramatization, letting the facts do what facts did when they were organized well. She described the intercepted communication, Orochimaru's authentication, the documented observer positions, the operational timeline. She described the repositioning of the 3rd Reconnaissance Squad and the failure of the border incident. She described the chain of decisions that had led from an overheard conversation in Konoha to the document pile currently sitting in front of the investigative panel. Haku's advocate asked her 3 questions, all of them procedural challenges to the authentication methodology, none of which she couldn't answer, and when she answered the 3rd one, Yura made a sound that was either approval or the conclusion of a private calculation. And in 40 years, she had never heard Yura make any audible sound during a proceeding. Then Maru gave his testimony, which was the most interesting part of the morning to watch. He described his role in authorizing the original intelligence operation, the one she'd stopped in the scrubland, with a precision that walked exactly the line between full disclosure and self-protection. He was experienced enough to understand that the only path through this proceeding with his position intact was to be more forthcoming than he was required to be, and experienced enough to calibrate exactly how forthcoming that was. He acknowledged the authorization. He acknowledged that it had proceeded without full disclosure to the Keizuke's office. He did not acknowledge that he'd known Haku had an external arrangement, but the phrasing he used to not acknowledge it was specific enough that everyone in the room understood he had known, which was its own kind of admission and its own kind of trade. She watched Gaara listen to Maru's testimony with the complete stillness of someone processing multiple things simultaneously, and making decisions about each of them with the economy of a person who had long since learned to manage a great deal at once. After Maru, 2 members of the repositioned Sand Patrol gave accounts of their redirected orders and the subsequent border monitoring. After that, the 3 captured route observers gave testimonies via written deposition, 2 cooperative, 1 partial, all 3 connecting the operation at the border to the communication framework Orochimaru's intercept had identified. Haku gave his own account at midday. He was, she had to acknowledge, composed. He accepted the formal charge with the language of a man taking responsibility without performing either contrition or defiance, and he explained his reasoning in a way that she recognized with a cold clarity because she had heard it in every room like this one, spoken by every version of this kind of person, for as long as she had been paying attention. He had believed it was necessary. He had believed Suna needed leverage, and leverage required action, and action in service of the village's survival was the definition of acceptable risk. He had believed that a shinobi world in which Konoha controlled the most powerful Jinchuriki without external accountability was a world in which Suna would always be the smaller power at a negotiating table. He had believed, in other words, that the people involved were less important than the position. She watched the council listen to it. She watched Yura, whose face gave nothing away. She watched the 2 younger members, who had come into this proceeding as political novices and were leaving it as something else. She watched Gaara, who listened to Haku's account of why it had been necessary the way he listened to everything difficult, without flinching, because he had learned a long time ago that flinching didn't help. When Haku finished, Gaara was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The council is satisfied that the charge is established. Elder Haku is formally removed from the council pending the conclusion of the full investigation." He looked at the room. "This proceeding is the beginning of a review of authorization protocols across all intelligence operations, joint and internal. Maru's office will cooperate with that review fully." He said it without looking at Maru, which was the kind of thing that landed harder for the not looking. Suna's relationship with Konoha in this matter is joint and documented. The investigation proceeds in coordination. He closed the proceeding. Afterward, the chamber emptied with the subdued efficiency of people processing a large thing, and Temari stayed in her chair while the others filed out, looking at the stone walls and the oil lamps and the absence of windows, and she thought that the room itself hadn't changed, but something in the way it felt had, and she didn't know if that was real or if she was projecting her own state onto architecture, and decided it didn't matter. "Good work," Gara said from the doorway. She looked at him. He was already half-turned toward the corridor because he had 8 hours of other work waiting, and this was what Kei's kidship looked like in practice. The hard thing followed immediately by the next hard thing. "It's not done," she said. "No," he agreed, "but the part that needed you to be the one doing it is done." He paused. "The rest is governance. That's my part." She looked at him for a moment. This was the brother she had watched from across a room for years, careful and distant because the alternative had been dangerous, and who had become, in the years since a loud Konoha boy had refused to do the easy math, the person she trusted most in the world without qualification. "Go do your part," she said. He went. She was on the roof by evening. Not because she needed to think, she'd done the thinking, the deciding was done, the plan had executed, but because the roof had become the place where she went when things had resolved into their new shape, and she needed a moment to be in it before moving to the next thing. The sun was going down in its usual dramatic fashion, the amber to purple gradient refusing to be understated, and the village below was ordinary in all its evening rhythms. People finishing work and starting the other version of their lives, the sounds of it familiar and specific and hers. Her sand radio was in her hand. Not waiting for anything, she'd already received the message she was expecting. It had come 2 hours ago, shortly after midday. From Naruto through the joint mission channel, a single message that was longer than his usual operational brevity. "Finished. Took 4 hours. I said everything." Tsunade has it all, the full file, the observer testimony, the border incident documentation, the safe house records. The council is contesting it, but she moved the proceeding to a military tribunal format which takes them out of the adjudication role. Danzo's legal counsel is arguing jurisdiction. They'll lose. Kakashi was in the room, and after it was done he told me I did good, and that was the most he said in one go in about 3 years, so I'm counting it. I'll be in sooner in 2 days if that's all right. Gara said something about a formal documentation meeting. I think that's real, but I also think it was an excuse. Either way, 2 days. She'd read it 3 times when it arrived, which she acknowledged was unnecessary for full comprehension, and had sent back. 2 days is fine. Don't take the northern route. There's a sandstorm system building near the checkpoint. Come through the valley pass instead. He'd sent back, "How do you always know where the storms are?" She'd sent, "I pay attention." He'd sent, "Yeah, you do." She sat on the roof now with the radio in her hand and the sun going down and thought about 2 days. She spent those 2 days doing the work that came after, the formal documentation filings, the coordination correspondence with Konoha's proceeding, a lengthy meeting with Maru that was the most honest conversation she'd ever had with him, characterized by the specific frankness that came when 2 intelligent people who had been circling each other finally stopped circling. He told her, in the measured way that was just his idiom, that he had known more about Haku's external communications than he'd officially acknowledged, that he had assessed the risk as manageable and had been wrong, that he had also assessed her intervention in the scrubland as a net positive for Suna despite its procedural complications, and had not said so at the time because the political dynamics made saying so counterproductive. She told him that she didn't trust him completely and didn't expect to, but that she trusted his pragmatism, and that pragmatism pointed in the same direction as the right thing often enough that it was workable. He looked at her with something that was probably as close to approval as Maru got and said, "Your father would have been proud of you, your mother too." She held that for a moment, didn't deflect it and didn't perform a reaction to it, just let it land. "The authorization review," she said. "I want to be part of that process. I assumed you would." He slid a document across the desk. "I've already put your name on the working group." She took the document. His name was on it too, which was either a peace offering or a strategic positioning or both. With Maru, it was always both. "Don't run operations I don't know about," she said. "I'll endeavor," he said, which with Maru meant yes. She left his office and went home and slept properly for the first time in what felt like 2 weeks. Naruto arrived on the afternoon of the second day, coming through the valley pass as she'd told him to, appearing at Suna's gates in the golden hour when the light hit everything at the right angle and made the sandstone look like it was internally illuminated. She knew he'd arrived before she saw him because the gate guard's chakra signatures shifted in the way they did when something notable came through. Not alarm, just attention, the reflexive recognition of someone significant. She met him in the administrative district, because the formal documentation meeting with Gaara was real and she'd confirmed it, and because meeting him at the gate would have been something she wasn't ready to name yet. He looked like someone who had spent 4 hours in front of a military tribunal and then 2 days traveling through a valley pass and was completely fine about all of it. He was in his Jonin vest with the orange underneath it because apparently that was never going to change. And he had a mission pack on his back, and the particular quality of forward-moving energy she'd come to recognize as just his default state when things were going in the right direction. "Valley Pass is better than the checkpoint," he said when he reached her. "Clearer. I told you. You did." He fell into step beside her. "Gaara actually wants the documentation meeting." Gaara always actually wants the documentation meeting. He runs a village, Naruto. There is always a documentation meeting. Right. He looked around at Suna's streets with the attentiveness he gave to things he found genuinely interesting. She watched him take in the architecture, the way the light moved differently here than in Konoha, the specific quality of the afternoon heat. "It's different than I remembered. You've been here before. Once. He stopped. During a bad time." He said it lightly, but she understood what he meant, the failed Akatsuki extraction attempt when Gaara had died and been brought back and the village had been in crisis. "It looks different now. Gaara rebuilt a lot of it." She paused. He had thoughts about what a village should look like when it actually worked. Naruto glanced at her, and in the glance was something she recognized, the expression of someone hearing the weight of years in a few words and choosing to sit with it rather than fill it with commentary. She appreciated that. He was getting better at the silence thing. "How did it go?" she said. "The tribunal, honestly." He thought for a moment. "It went the way hard things go when they go right," he said. "Which means it wasn't clean and it wasn't easy, and at one point Danzo's counsel tried to argue that the side documents were fabricated, and I had to sit there while Tsunade systematically dismantled that argument and couldn't say anything, which was genuinely the most difficult part." He paused, and there was a moment where Koharu made an argument about strategic necessity that was basically a more formal version of what you described Haku saying, and I thought about. He stopped. "Jirya," she said. "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. "Yeah, I thought about Jirya, and I didn't lose it. I was proud of that." He said it without self-congratulation, just an honest accounting. "I said what I needed to say, and I said it clearly, and I didn't make it about being angry. I made it about what was documented, what was done, what the proceeding required. That's the right way to do it. It didn't feel right in the moment." He looked at the street ahead. "It felt like swallowing something." "Yes," she said, "it does." She paused. "It's still right." He nodded. Once. The motion that meant he'd made his peace with something. The administrative building came into view and they walked toward it in the late light. And she thought about the shape of what had been built over the last 3 weeks. Not the investigations or the formal proceedings, but the thing between the two of them, which was also built on something solid, and which she had been carefully not naming because naming things made them subject to complication, and she had enough complications. But she acknowledged privately, running out of legitimate reasons to not name it. Gaara's documentation meeting was exactly what a documentation meeting was. A 2-hour review of the joint filing protocols for the parallel investigations, the coordination framework for ongoing intelligence sharing, the formal establishment of the liaison communication channel that had until now been operating on a handshake and a mission channel workaround. Gaara ran it with his characteristic precision. asking specific questions, making decisions immediately when presented with options, producing a signed framework document by the end that covered every contingency she'd thought of and two she hadn't. Naruto sat across from Gaara for 2 hours and they were, she observed, genuinely interesting to watch in a room together. Not because there was tension, there wasn't, but because of the absence of tension in a context where most people would have generated some. They had a comfortable directness with each other, the specific ease of people who had met at the worst possible moment and come through it with something real. Gaara asked Naruto's opinion on the liaison protocol parameters, and Naruto gave it without deferring to Gaara's status, and Gaara took it without qualifying it, and they moved on. And she watched it and thought about what it had cost to build that and what it was worth. At the end of the meeting, when the document was signed and the administrative staff had filed it appropriately, Gaara looked at Naruto across the table with the expression he used for things he wasn't going to say elaborately. "Thank you," he said. Naruto looked at him. "I didn't do it for—" "I know," Gaara said. "That's why I'm thanking you." Naruto was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, and the nod contained several things that weren't going to be said out loud. And Gaara received them with the particular attentiveness of someone who had learned to hear the things that weren't said, because for a long time nothing was said to him at all. She looked away at the window, the one window in this building that Gaara had installed himself, looking out over Suna's western district toward the dunes, because the Kazekage office should be able to see what it was governing. They walked out of the administrative building into the early evening, Suna's streets going gold in the last light, the heat of the day finally releasing into the cooler air that came off the desert after sundown. The village was in its between time, work done, evening not yet started, the particular quiet that came in the gap. They walked without a destination, because sometimes that was the right speed for whatever was happening. So, Naruto said. So she said, Danzo's proceeding runs another 3 weeks minimum. Haku's runs about the same. Tsunade thinks she can push through a restructuring of Root's authorization framework by the end of the month. Kakashi's going to lead the transition team. He paused. He seemed relieved to have something to do that wasn't watching people carefully from a distance. That's been his entire career. I know, that's why I said it. He looked at the street, the buildings, the way the shadows were moving. After the restructuring clears, after the proceedings close, things go back to a new normal. They do. Suna and Konoha have a functioning joint intelligence framework. They do. And you and I, he stopped. Not because he'd run out of the thought, but because he was choosing the right framing for it, she could tell. We have this, he said finally, gesturing vaguely at the space between them and around them, which was an imprecise gesture, but she understood what he meant. We have this, she agreed. He looked at her. In the evening light his face was clear and direct, the whisker marks distinct, his eyes carrying all the things he was careful not to perform. I don't know exactly what this is, he said. Neither do I, she said. Exactly. But it's real, she said. He held her gaze. Yeah, something in his voice was very simple and very certain. Yeah, it's real. She looked at him and thought about precision, about the difference between being careful and being honest, between managing a situation and being in it. She had been precise about everything for her entire professional life, and it had served her well, and she had also used it, sometimes, as a way to maintain the kind of distance that felt like safety but was actually just distance. I'm not good at the parts that aren't tactical, she said. It came out more directly than she'd planned, which was its own kind of answer. I know! He didn't say it dismissively. He said it like someone who had observed a true thing and accepted it. I'm not great at the parts that aren't forward motion. He paused. But I'm okay at being patient when something is worth being patient about. She looked at him for a long moment. Don't tell Kankuro, she said. Something crossed his face, relief and amusement, and the specific warmth of someone who had been given something they weren't going to take for granted. Kankuro will figure it out himself, he said. He's smarter than he performs. He absolutely is, and I will deny I said that. He laughed, the real one, short and genuine, the one that was nothing like the performed brightness, and the sound of it moved through the street and she watched it happen and thought that this was what things looked like when they were right. Not clean, not certain, not tied off, just real and moving forward and worth being in. She took him to the roof. Not her usual roof. The administrative buildings was too exposed, too official. She took him to the training hall roof on the building's south side, which was lower and less visible and had a better angle on the western dunes, and they sat on the warm stone with the last red edge of the sun flattening against the horizon and the stars beginning their gradual appearance overhead. Sooner below them was settling into night. The sounds of it drifted up, voices, distant music from somewhere, the ordinary accumulation of a village being itself. "Do you know what you're going to do?" she said. "After, when the proceedings close and everything settles." He thought about it genuinely, which she appreciated. He didn't reach for the automatic answer. "Keep going," he said. "I'm still going to be a Jonin in Konoha. I'm still going to take missions, train, do the work." He paused. "The Hokage thing is still a real goal." "It's still a real goal," he confirmed. "But I think about it differently now. Not the version where everyone loves me because I earned it. More the version where," he paused, finding it, "where you're responsible for the thing, what you said before about protecting it and burning down the parts that are wrong." He looked at the horizon. "I want to be that version." "You're already most of the way there," she said. "You just needed the full picture." "I needed someone to give me the full picture," he said. She looked at the dunes. "The full picture wasn't mine to give. It was already there in your village, in your life. You saw it and told me," he said, "when you didn't have to, when it would have been easier not to." He turned to look at her. "Don't undercount that." She thought about the blank piece of paper in the Konoha Inn, the 2 words she'd written and crossed out, the decision she'd made before she'd admitted to herself she was making it. She thought about running across secondary dunes for 4 hours. She thought about a room with no windows and the specific cold certainty of deciding you weren't going to be that. "I don't undercount it," she said. "I know what it was." "What was it?" She looked at him. "A choice," she said. "I made it because it was right, and because I was angry, and because I had been watching the same story play out my whole life, and I was done watching it." She paused. "And because you asked me a question on a training ground and I couldn't stop thinking about the answer." He was looking at her with that completely open expression, the one with nothing guarded in it. "What was the answer?" he said. "The answer was that I was going to tell you," she said. "I just needed to understand why before I admitted it." "Why?" he said, not pushing, genuinely asking. She thought about Gaara at 14 and Gaara now. She thought about the distance between those 2 things measured in years and in one persistent, infuriating person who had refused to do the math the way everyone else was doing it. She thought about the way Naruto had looked in the desert when she'd told him about Danzo, not collapsed, not broken, just absorbing the full shape of a thing and standing up inside it. "Because you're not afraid of the full picture," she said. "You were hurt by it, but you weren't afraid of it." She looked at the horizon. "I've spent my entire life in rooms with people who were afraid of what they might see if they looked at things directly. I didn't realize how tired I was of that until I met someone who wasn't." The silence that followed was the right kind, not empty but full, the kind that happened when something had been said that was large enough to need a moment around it. "I'm afraid of some things," he said finally. "I know." She glanced at him. "I said you weren't afraid of the full picture. I didn't say you weren't human." He looked at her for a moment. Then he turned back to the horizon, and she turned back to the horizon, and the stars were all out now, the desert sky doing its enormous clear night thing, overwhelming and indifferent and gorgeous. "Temari," he said. "Naruto. Can I?" He stopped, and she watched him for a moment, which was interesting because it was rare to catch him uncertain in his movements. He turned to look at her fully. "Is this the part where I would normally say something and you'd tell me I'm being impractical?" "Probably," she said. "Say it anyway." He did. He said it in his direct, honest, completely unornamented way, without performance or strategy. The same way he thanked ramen chefs and told Gaara he was worth something and pushed through wind walls because he'd calculated it was the faster solution, just the true thing, said because it was true. She listened to it. She sat with it for a moment. The desert was dark and enormous, and the stars were extraordinary, and the village below them was warm and ordinary and alive. "That's not impractical," she said. He looked at her. "It's inconvenient," she said. "2 villages, different missions, no clean way to manage the logistics of it." She met his eyes. "But it's not impractical." "Those are different things," he said. "Those are very different things," she confirmed. The corner of his mouth moved. Not the full smile, the real one, the quieter one. the one that came out when something mattered and he wasn't performing. She looked at it and thought that she was going to keep encountering that smile in the future, and she was going to keep finding it worth looking at, which was its own kind of decision. The logistics aren't actually that bad, he said. Konoha and Suna have a joint intelligence framework now. We do, she said. Lots of reasons for a liaison to travel. Lots of reasons, he agreed. She looked back at the stars. Don't make promises you can't keep about how often you'll be here. I won't make promises, he said. I'll just show up. She thought about the training ground, the checkpoint wall, the desert draw with a small fire and a question asked at someone's back, the dunes at 4 hours run. Yeah, she said, that tracks. 2 weeks later, Suna's Authorization Review Working Group held its first formal session. Temari sat at the table with Maru and 3 other members, the documents spread between them, the process beginning in the deliberate, unglamorous way that actual change moved, one provision at a time, one protocol rewritten, one safeguard built into the structure that hadn't been there before. It was not exciting work. It was important work, which was different and in most ways better. She thought during a break in the 3rd hour while she was drinking tea and looking at the revised intelligence-sharing guidelines about what Orochimaru had said. The shinobi world is reorganizing. She thought about what it meant to be part of the reorganization rather than the disruption of it, to do the slower, less visible work of rebuilding the things that should have existed and now would. Her sand radio buzzed. A message from the Joint Mission Channel, short, and from a routing address she recognized now the way she recognized a familiar handwriting. Danzo formally removed from all positions pending outcome of proceeding. Koharu and Hamura filed a formal objection. Tsunade denied it in writing and it is now part of the permanent record. Kakashi says she smiled when she signed the denial, which apparently she almost never does. Thought you should know, she read it twice. Then she wrote back, good, how are you? His response took 4 minutes, good, tired, working on something. You. She looked around the room at the documents, the working group, the slow machinery of a village deciding to do better by its people. She looked at the window Gaara had put in the Keizukage office, the one that looked out over the village, the one that said this is what you're responsible for, look at it. She typed, good, working on something. His response was immediate, same. Then, after a moment, Friday, she looked at the authorization review documents, counted the days, thought about the valley pass and the late afternoon light and a roof with a better angle on the western dunes. Friday, she sent back. She put the radio away and picked up the next document and went back to work. And outside the window Suna was bright and ordinary in the afternoon, and the wind was moving off the desert with the clean, directionless energy of something that had always been there and always would be, carrying whatever it carried, going wherever it went. She decided, good with that. She was good with a lot of things now. 3 months later, when the formal proceedings had concluded and the restructuring was underway, and the shinobi world was in the early, uncertain stages of looking like something different than it had, Temari wrote a single-page summary of the events for the Keizukage official record. She wrote it the way she did everything, precisely, completely, without editorializing. She described the intelligence acquisition in Konoha, the decisions she'd made and why, the operations that had followed, the outcomes. She wrote about Haku's removal and Danzo's removal and the joint framework, and what it was designed to do. At the end, where the official template had a field for contributing factors, she wrote, accurate and complete information, shared in time. Gaara read the summary, signed it, and filed it. He said nothing about the last line. He didn't need to. She went home. She made tea. She sat at the writing desk where she'd held a blank piece of paper and written 2 words and crossed them out, and she didn't cross anything out now. She just sat with the evening and the quiet and the particular feeling of having been in a situation that required everything she had, and having had enough. Outside, the wind moved through Suna the way it always had, over the buildings, through the streets, off the dunes, and back again. The old, permanent wind that had been there before the village and would be there after, that carried sand and cold and distance, that didn't distinguish between what it swept away and what it left standing. What stood was what was built to stand. She picked up the tea, drank it, watched the light go out of the sky through the window. On Friday, the valley pass would be clear.